Hey, how you doing? Hope you all are doing great. As you've seen in the thumbnail, in this video, we're going to see what if Ash found Lost Myth Pokemon. This is part 1. And for more complete 670 likes on this video. And before getting into video, I request you to check the author of this fanfic and show some love and support. Name of the story is Legends of the Tide by Mystic Vaporeon. Do check it out. All details and description. Let's get into the video. Ash Ketchum stared blankly at the shredded map before him, bits of it floating lazily away in the breeze. Misty stood next to it, her arms folded across her chest triumphantly. I bet you're pretty proud of yourself, aren't you? Ash hissed, picking up the remains of the map. Yep, Misty replied bluntly. Brock sat down on a nearby rock and pulled out a book he had been reading. Pikachu more than willingly joined him. Misty, I'm going to stay calm. But why on earth did you do that? Ash screamed. Misty looked indignant for only a moment before retaliating. Because it wasn't doing us any good, and I saw no point in having it, she answered spitefully. Ash forgot the pieces of map and pointed his finger accusingly at Misty. Now for once it isn't my fault we're lost, he said pedantically. The fight was white noise in Brock's ears. He knew they weren't lost. There was a town not far from there that they could spend the night in. He'd once stayed there with his mother on a vacation before she passed away. He folded the page of his book back down and jabbed it quickly back into his pack. I hate to break you two up, but there's a small little town just about a mile from here we can stay at, he said practically. Ash and Misty both stared at him from their battle positions, each leaning forward to further project their own opinion at the other. Really? What city? I didn't see one on the map, Misty said, walking over to sit down next to her friend. Brock ran a hand through his hair nervously. Well, it's not on the map. It's really too small to be even considered a city. It's called Periwinkle Village. I've been there once before. They can offer us some food and a place to stay for the night, he offered hopefully. Ash cocked his head to one side thoughtfully. Well, if they have at least they can offer Princess Misty a place of reverence. By their Growlithe, of course, he said. Misty understood the rather rude joke. Oh, so now I'm the dog princess, am I? She replied, raising one eyebrow. Pikachu then decided to take matters into his own hands, giving all present a swift electric shock. Ash, Misty, and Brock all had a good shriek before falling to the ground a lovely shade of brown. Thanks, Pikachu, Ash groaned. The electric rodent grinned with relish and hopped upon its master. Pika, Pikachu, he protested. He's right, we'd better get going, Misty said, brushing the soot from her clothes. Ash and Brock followed as she began down the beaten dirt path. They traveled all the rest of the day. Ash walked out in front. He sensed something in the air, and something was very different, if not wrong. Though Misty and Brock were oblivious to it, Ash knew where he was going. He felt the pull of the village, and he let it guide him. He was not surprised that at dusk, they arrived on the outskirts of what looked like a village. Ash didn't even stop before proceeding into the very center of the town. There he saw it. The statue was there. It marked the very center of all the mass of Periwinkle. All roads led away from it or to it, depending on how you looked at it. It was often a joke amongst the school children. If you thought the roads led away, you were a dreamer and were destined to leave. If you thought they all lead to it, you'd be just like everyone else. Needless to say, most everyone chose to say they led away for fear of being called boring, but everyone knew in their hearts that the roads all lead to the statue. The figure itself was of 5 humans, or at least what looked like humans. One had a pair of great wings and a long flowing tail of feathers. The other, who had its arm wrapped around the waist of the bird figure, had a long whip-like tail and angry-looking talons where fingers should have been. These two stood in the back. In the foreground, a strong, bulky, rock-like man stood, and in the very front, a mermaid figure with a fish tail extending out from its spine and fins adorning its head. The representation that caught Ash's eye particularly was the one with flames. It seemed the leader of this pack of beautiful creatures, its crest ablaze with intense flames and an inferno running the lengths of its arms and legs. The statue was a masterful piece of art. It is so beautiful, Misty breathed, standing closer to Ash. He nodded in agreement and reached to his shoulder to absent-mindedly pet Pikachu. Pika, he yelled in boredom. Ash was finally freed from the trance and laughed. All right, I get the picture. We'll go find a place to stay, he said, closing his eyes happily. Excuse me. Ash whirled around in surprise to see a kindly-looking young woman standing behind him. He sighed in relief and greeted her kindly. May I help you, miss? By the way, my name is Brock, and I act. Brock didn't get very far with that conversation before Misty had dragged him away. I'm sorry. I just thought I heard you say you needed a place to stay tonight. The woman answered sheepishly. We do. Is there a hotel or inn you could recommend to us? Misty asked. The woman shook her head. There isn't any inn or hotel here. I was wondering if you'd like to stay with my grandmother and I tonight, she said quietly. Is that the only place to stay? Ash asked warily. The youth nodded somberly. Ash shrugged and looked to his friends. I guess it's probably a long walk to Celadon City, and it's nearly night, Misty answered, noticing the odd quietness of the town square. She had imagined it would be the busiest place of the town, full of people and stores and in general, life. Instead, it was a lonely place. The stone of the buildings echoed every sound, and a nonchalant breeze rustled piles of dead leaves, making the scene quite eerie indeed. Misty wrapped her arms around her bare shoulders, the slight anxiety and the breeze making a chill run up and down her spine. Let's go, Ash, she encouraged. Seeing it was his only option, Ash nodded an affirmative and accepted the woman's invitation. She smiled vaguely and motioned for them to follow. Our home is this way. Please follow me, she said. The trio followed her through the narrow, winding streets of Periwinkle Village, walking by many tiny, seemingly lifeless homes. If Ash hadn't known better, he would have sworn no one at all lived there. So what's your name? Brock asked to break the silence. Who, me? Oh, my name is Gina. Pleased to meet you, she answered, not bothering to look back at Brock. I'm Brock. This is Ash and Misty. We're pleased to meet you as well. Thank you very much for letting us stay with you, he said. There are a few other travelers staying tonight. You won't mind, I hope? Gina asked. Brock shook his head vigorously. Suddenly, Ash noticed something out of the corner of his eye and stopped. It was a tiny shop tucked in the corner of a block of other buildings. He pressed his nose against the glass and blew hard, clouding it. Inside was a collection of carved crystal dragons, each a different color. Next to it was a set of silver rings, all entwined with one another in a bizarre pattern. He looked up. The ceiling was decorated with brightly colored strips, silk, and creased paper lanterns, all obviously hand-painted with Pokemon and delicate floral designs. Ash was totally oblivious to Misty and Brock staring with him. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply, already picking up a hint of incense from inside. We've got to see this tomorrow, Ash whispered. No, don't go anywhere near this shop or the old man who runs it. Ash jumped, startled by Gina's sharp words. What? Why? He asked. Gina sighed. That old man is crazy. He believes all the legends are true. Terrible stories, terrible legend. Just trust me on this, will you? She explained. Ash was disturbed to some extent by the response, but nodded in agreement. Gina nodded back and led them a few blocks away to a tiny cottage. She opened the door and ushered her guests in graciously. Ash, Misty, and Brock all gasped in unison when they stepped inside the cottage. For who should they see eating soup at the small wooden table but none other than the Rocket Trio? It's you. Jessie choked. Oh, it's Team Rocket. What are you guys doing here? Ash asked, exasperated. Well, we were just looking for a place to stay. But not here. It's been infested with rats, James said, sounding rather intelligent for a change. You know these people? Gina asked worriedly. Of course. They only try to steal Pikachu every single time we ever see them. Ash mused. Jessie sighed. Can't we please just stay away from each other and spend one night in the same house? All we want is a place to stay for the night, she said rather angrily. It was then Ash noticed that they didn't have their uniforms on, and they looked odd without the blazing red or across the chest. Meowth must have noticed the staring because he stepped forward somberly. We got booted out, he whispered sadly. Jessie and James burst into tears and embraced one another, falling comically to the floor. What? You mean you got fired? Jessie and James wailed in unison. Ash was not sure, but after some more thought, he deduced that none of the trio was smart enough to pull a stunt like this off. You guys can stay, and we'll stay too, he said after the weeping had somewhat quelled. Really? You mean it? Jesse and James asked. Ash nodded, and they resumed eating. Gina breathed a sigh of relief. Grandma, we have some more travelers. She called through cupped hands. I'll buy a Persian's whiskers. I'll have some more soup ready in a moment, Gina dear, the old voice answered from the kitchen. Gina smiled warmly and turned to her guests. Come with me. I'll show you to your rooms, she said. She led Ash and his companions to the back of the modest home where there were 3 doors. I'm sorry, 2 of you will have to share, Gina said quietly. Ash had a moment of terror before Brock grabbed his arm and dragged him into the far right room. Ash, and I'll share. Misty, you can have your own, he said. Ash breathed a heavy sigh of relief as Brock closed the door behind him. Thanks, Brock, he said quietly. No prob, he answered. Ash set his backpack down on the bed, and Pikachu promptly deemed himself the bed tester, leaping dramatically onto the pillow. Pika Pika, he cried joyously. How is it, Pikachu? Ash asked, laughing. Pikachu gave a small victory sign to ensure that it was of high quality. Ash smiled and turned around as a knock sounded at the door. The dinner is ready if you're hungry, Gina said. Ash noticed an air of sadness that always seemed to follow her voice. Coming, he called and removed his hat before scooping Pikachu up and dashing out the door. Misty was already at the table, shoveling large spoonfuls of the creamy liquid into her mouth when Ash and Brock arrived. Jesse, James, and Meowth had long since finished and were talking somberly by the fire. They all looked quite concerned as James took a single bill out of his pocket. Ash felt sorry for them. He knew that was most likely the last of their money. He set Pikachu down on the wooden table before a small saucer filled just for his usage. Ash, come on, sit down and eat with us. Gina's grandmother is a great cook, Misty managed to say between spoons. Thank you, dear. Ash turned his attention away from the trio at the fire and saw for the first time the ancient woman. She had a pleasant demeanor with long gray hair tied firmly back behind her head in a bun. Her eyes smiled at him as he took the first taste of her special soup. Ash was instantly addicted. It was one of the most wonderful tasting things he'd ever eaten. This is wonderful. What is it anyway? He asked. The old woman winked and raised one finger jokingly into the air. That's my secret, lad. By the way, feel free to call me May, she answered cheerfully. Ash jumped as Jessie suddenly flew from her position at the fire and stomped angrily off to the room she and James would share. James sighed and leaned forward, cupping his forehead in his hands. Ash's spirits grew sullen. Team Rocket was falling on some hard times for sure. He looked away from the depressed youth sitting at the hearth and turned to his friends. It had now grown quite late, and, having eaten, Pikachu was curled up asleep in Misty's lap. Ash, he's making me sleepy. Get him off, she moaned groggily. Ash smiled and got up from his seat. He sauntered over to the redhead and laid his hand on her shoulder. What'll you give me to take him? He asked, grinning smugly. I won't dump him on the floor. How about that? Misty replied. Ash shrugged and took the sleeping Pokemon from her lap. He blinked sleepily, but closed his eyes again as he saw it was Ash that held him. Come on, Pikachu. It's been a long day, and I think we need a good sleep about now, he said, motioning for Brock to come along. James and Meowth had since gone to their room to try to cheer Jessie up. The fire had dwindled, and May was beginning to shut things up for the night. Ash hugged Pikachu close and retreated back to the bedroom, Brock close at his heels. Misty followed after generously helping clear the soup dishes from the table, explaining that it was the least she could do. Ash paused for a moment at the door of the other group. James, we're broke, and that's all there is to it. There's no even getting out of this now. He heard Jessie wail. I know we're broke, but we have to eat somehow. I had to spend that money. James replied, But we could have at least found something a little cheaper, couldn't we? Jessie, I don't think we can get any cheaper than this, James replied. There was a long silence, and just as Ash turned to go, he heard one last fearful phrase. I'm scared, James. Jessie, said, the tears apparent in her voice. Me too, he answered. Ash closed his eyes sadly and stepped into his room. Hey, Ash, what's wrong? Brock asked from his bed. Oh, just Jessie and James, he replied. Why are you upset over those two? Brock asked cynically. Ash shrugged. Nothing. I guess I'm just tired, he said, and set Pikachu down on the pillow. He yawned, stretched, and curled into a more comfortable ball. Ash smiled and ran his hand down the silky golden fur, climbing gently onto the bed with him. He surveyed the room around him. There was a small nightstand between the two beds and a bookcase lining one side of the room. Apart from a single dilapidated chair in the corner, this was the only furniture. Not even a picture brightened the dingy, yellowish earthen walls. Ash was able to reach the bookcase by leaning over the bed, and he scanned over the books with his fingers. They were all old, their spines peeling away from the pages and the leather covers shredding in all corners. But one very tiny book at the very bottom caught his eye. It was bound in what must have once been a brilliant green leather. He turned it over, and there was no title or author, just a symbol. It was a delicate weaving of intricate lines, a veritable spider web with gems woven into it. They would have once been colored, but in spite of the age, they'd faded to a dull, tarnished color. Ash, intrigued by this piece of history, opened the cover to find a map on the first page. It was so weird in there. How can we resist? Brock said jokingly. Ash laughed in response and focused on the story unfolding in the old script. The world of chaos shall in turn be healed by the great powers of good, who shall rise against the corrupt oppressor and free the good people of this world again. The world shall hold its breath in waiting for the fateful day when the heroes return to rule over all with a benevolent hand. Ash sighed at the beautiful words in the book and closed it. He replaced it on the shell and clicked the light out. "Night, Brock," he breathed. "MMM," the already half-asleep youth replied. Ash petted Pikachu one last time before slipping under the blankets. "Cha!" He yawned, disturbed slightly. Ash quieted him, and he nearly immediately fell back asleep. Ash himself yawned and closed his eyes. He rolled over onto his side and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, Ash awoke early, too early in his mind. He closed his eyes in an attempt to go back to sleep, but as no sleep came, he groggily and carefully slipped out of bed. He pulled on his shoes and hat, and, leaving his backpack but taking some money, opened the door slowly and exited the room. He crept to the front of the cottage and stealthily slunk out the front door. Once out in the street in the brisk morning, Ash lost his cautious air and began strolling happily down towards the curious little shop. He took in all the sights around him, the pleasant early morning light just breaking over the lush green hills, the simplicity of the entire town. It was strangely calming. Before he even knew how far he had walked, Ash found himself in front of the shop. He turned on his heel and jogged to the front door, but was dismayed at the hand-painted close sign. He banged one fist gently against the glass and continued of his way. "Wait, young man. Please come back." The word was spoken with a heavy Japanese accent, and Ash turned around to see a small old man hop out of the door to the shop. Ash smiled and turned back, and a lively old man welcomed him inside. He was greeted by the sweet smell of jasmine incense and the wonderful colors of the beautiful array of everything that the old man held dear. "Ah, I see you have great taste," the old man mused behind Ash. "I love everything about this place. My name's Ash," he said, extending his hand to the old man. "Most people just call me that old man, but you dear boy may call me Mr. Lau," he said, clasping and shaking a bewildered Ash's hand. He absent-mindedly picked up a crystal dragon, running his fingers along the intricately carved scales and wings. "Is it true what Gina said? Do you even know her?" Ash asked. "Mr. Lao Sai. Gina had a rough childhood. She do not know me. Her mother, she died when Gina was about 12, I think. She was frequent visitor here. She loved the legends and the myths I used to tell her. I think Gina blamed me," he explained. Ash replaced the dragon and shuffled to the counter where a set of rings lay on blue silk. There were 7 of them, all with delicately coiled silver bands. Each had a different colored stone in it. One yellow, purple, blue, gray, clear, red, and one was a milky white stone that was solid, not clear as the others were. "I read something about a legend last night," Ash mused. "What legend?" Ash whirled around to see Misty and Brock standing in the doorway. He laughed as Pikachu ran up and leapt into his arms. "Pika-Pie," he shouted happily. "Hey, Pikachu, like those rings?" Ash asked, letting Pikachu down on the glass case. "P-Thi," he breathed, staring at them. "Good morning. Welcome. I am Mr. Lau." He called them Misty and Brock. James stopped in front of the door and peered in. He saw everything that was on display and was utterly transfixed. Though he had literally no money, he pushed open the glass door, causing the small bell to jingle. "James, what on earth are you doing?" Jesse called, scampering into the shop after him. "I'm just looking," he replied. "But James, we have to this is gorgeous," she exclaimed. Ash swallowed hard. After all, it was only the night before he had heard their conversation. "What is this place?" Meowth asked. "It's just my shop, welcome. I am Mr. Lau." Ash groaned at the third time he'd heard that, and the extremely heavy Japanese accent was beginning to get to him. He had a deep, rich voice, though, that resounded warmly throughout the store. He couldn't imagine why Gina blamed such a kind man for her mother's death. "James," he said, shaking Mr. Lau's outstretched hand. "You know the legend, maybe?" he asked. James shook his head. "Only Ash know the legend?" "Then sit down all, and Mr. Lau will tell," he said, moving to the front of the store. He swiftly clicked the blinds shut, and Ash took that as a signal to sit down. Misty, Brock, Jesse, James, and even Meowth sat in a semicircle around Mr. Lau, who sat on a red velvet footstool. Pikachu leapt deftly into Ash's lap from the counter. Mr. Lau reached to a small wooden box on a glass shelf behind the cash register and pulled out an overly long pipe. It was carved like a traditional dragon, its mouth open wide for the tobacco to be smoked. Mr. Lau emptied the last of the contents of a deep blue bag into it and stuck a match. He lifted the pipe to his mouth and lit the contents ablaze. He exhaled in serenity, blue smoke curling lazily around his head, and began his story. Many years ago, it was an old legend that there was another world besides this one. It was known as Aradine, and only by that name, for it had no countries or states, only the occasional city. The people were peaceful, but without a ruler there are bound to be some disagreements. For the people of Aradine saw no need for the peace to be disturbed by such thing as a ruler. A strange woman came to them claiming that she had been sent by the gods. The people, being very religious, believed her, for she possessed the power of nature. She could manipulate it as she pleased. So naturally, she was revered as a god herself. But it was not to last. Her powers were of a kind that had been born with, for some did posse's magic. The people grew angry, but her magic was too strong, and the rebellion was quickly crushed. They rose again, but this time more secretly by a great sorcerer whose name has been forgotten in the winds of time. He created the 7 powers of peace. It is quite unknown what exactly these are, but these powers, perhaps magic spells or magical objects, who knows now? The legend is so old, the details have been washed away with the retelling. The powers were able to stop the evil queen, but the legend has it that she rose again after the noble sorcerer had passed on and the 7 powers forgotten, and declared a civil war to all those who disagreed with her dictatorship. Needless to say, some fearing for their very lives joined without question, but the noble others resisted and continued with the old way of life, and the world erupted in a civil war, which it supposedly remains in today. Waiting for the 7 powers to be awakened and come to their aid once again, the young trainers listened to the tale without a word, speechless at its seemingly sacredness. Ash closed his eyes. He could hear the battles, see the evil queen, the 7 powers, and even imagine himself fighting in an epic battle. Misty stood up and brushed the back of her jeans off. "Thank you ever so much for the story, Mr. Lau, and I hate to go without buying anything. But it's getting late, and if we hope to make it to the next town tonight, we need to get a move on," she said, hauling Ash and Brock up. Jesse and James also silently stood. It was obvious, at least to Ash, that they'd been touched by the tale as well. "Wait, I have a gift for each of you before you go," Mr. Lau exclaimed, flinging open the glass display case. Ash's breath caught in his chest as he took out the rings. "Each of you may choose one to keep," he explained happily. "Oh no, I couldn't," Ash began. "I insist. Please, I have plenty of other good things to sell. I can spare these." With the confirmation from Mr. Lau, Ash scrutinized the rings. He wanted the best one there. Misty gasped, dove forward, and plucked the blue ring from the case. "I love blue. It reminds me of the water," she said dreamily. "Excellent choice, young lady," Mr. Lau said, a devious grin creeping onto his face. Brock silently selected the gray ring as Ash was still deciding. "Hurry up, Ash," Misty whined, sliding her ring on her index finger. Ash scowled at her and ran his fingers over the cold stones. They came to rest on the brilliant red one, and he picked it up. It flashed brightly in his eyes, and he smiled. "I like this one," he said. Mr. Lau nodded approvingly and handed the yellow ring to Pikachu. "Pi?" he asked quizzically. "I wouldn't forget the young Pokemon, of course." He answered. Pikachu smiled and graciously took the glittering charm. James was hesitant, but Jessie stepped forward and immediately selected the deep purple item. "It has a certain beauty to it," she mused and allowed James to step up. There were only two left, the creamy white one and the clear. He didn't like the color of the other, so he lifted the clear piece of jewelry and slid it on his finger. Mr. Lau handed the last ring in the box to Meowth and closed it. If Ash had been looking, he would have seen the same symbol etched in the top as had been on the front of the book. "Goodbye, my friends, and do take care," Mr. Lau called after them. They all waved a farewell, and the old man watched them silently. "Let's hope I'm right on this one," he whispered and began laughing insanely. Ash thought he heard something, but he shrugged it off and proceeded instinctively to the town square. Once there, he stopped to take one last look at the strange statue. "I wonder what this is and who carved it, and even how old it is," he whispered. Misty shrugged and put her hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, but we'd better go," she said. Jessie and James stood behind them looking at the statue. "I didn't see this coming in, did you?" James asked. Jessie shook her head and brushed a strand of loose hair behind her ear. As she did so, she noticed a bright glow coming from the corner of her vision. James?" she whispered fearfully as she lowered her hand, where the purple stone in her ring was glowing brightly. He gasped in surprise and looked at his own ring. It too was shimmering. The glowing became so intense that Ash, Misty, Brock, and Pikachu couldn't help but look, and they turned around to form a haphazard circle. The rings shot forth, a mighty stream of light colliding in the middle with a cataclysmic flash. The last thing Ash could recall hearing was everyone present screaming in terror, and the image of the statue sinking into the ground to form some sort of portal and slipping through. Mr. Lau heard the event from his shop and smiled. "Now, my pawns, get ready to play the game," he said quietly. It was most likely the pounding in Ash's skull that awoken him. He groaned loudly and rolled over, squeezing his eyes shut against the bright sunlight. "Ash, get up." The voice was unfamiliar. "Please, Ash, this is really weird." Ash opened his eyes to see Pikachu sitting in front of him, an utterly terrified look on his face. "Ash, I can talk," he gasped. Ash's eyes widened in amazement. Up until now, Meowth had been the only Pokemon he knew of that could talk. Suddenly, the fiery ring pulsated quickly and flashed again. Ash closed his eyes as fire ignited itself along the lengths of his arms. It swept across his eyes, making a brilliant flame pattern from the corners to his temples, and then, with a burst of embers, the tips of the normally black, unruly hair went a bright crimson with flames. The last change to take place was a long fiery tail like that of a Charizard extended out behind him. It was on fire at the tip like his Pokemon, but the fire also continued up along the vertebrae like the spines along the backs of traditional Oriental dragons. Pikachu screamed. "What was that?" he exclaimed. Ash looked in wonder at his arms and tail. "To think I just evolved," he replied. Misty awoke, took one look at the new and improved Ash and shrieked. "It's okay, Misty, it's just me," he said. He stood up and brushed himself off and watched as the same thing happened to Misty. Her ring pulsed, then flashed, and he watched as she transformed into a beautiful water creature. She had the long mermaid-like tail resembling that of a Vaporeon with a sleek crest to match. Her entire body grew a light blue in color as her skin was replaced by slick, streamlined scales. The last thing to transform were her hands and feet. They became webbed with small, yet sharp-looking claws. She fiddled with her tail a moment, obviously liking what she saw. There were several flashes of light in succession, and Ash knew it was the others going through the same metamorphosis. Jessie and James sat up in unison, then, as Ash suspected, screamed at what they saw. "Jessie, what happened to you?" he asked. "Me? What about you?" she cried, pointing. James shrieked shrilly as he noted what had happened. Jessie had a long whip-like tail extending from the end of her spine. It was a beige color with dark brown band around it near the end. Her forearms and hands had also been replaced by the armored hide and claws of an Abra. To finish that look, she had the tiny pointed cat ears atop her head. James, however, was actually stunning. He had great cerulean blue wings, extending great lengths from his shoulder blades, and a long shimmering blue tail of feathers to use as a rudder. The shade also nearly perfectly matched his hair. Meowth and Pikachu remained unchanged, except for the fact that Pikachu now had the ability of English. "Brock?" Misty called. Ash snapped out of staring at the two humans at Misty's cry. He noticed the Brock was in fact missing. "I'm right here," he called and stepped forward from the shadows. He looked embarrassed at his new appearance, being simply a stone gray color. "What is going on?" he asked, fearfully examining his new complexion. James stood and helped Jesse up, and they walked over to join the group. He seemed quite interested in his foreign appendages, spreading them to their full length, then folding them back in again. Ash took a deep breath and addressed his friends. "Okay, we all know something really weird is going on here, but first things first. We should really try to figure out where we are," he said. "And no fighting," Misty said, forcefully staring in particular at Jesse and James. "I promise we won't cause trouble. We're not even Team Rocket anymore, remember?" James said, extending his hand. Ash smiled and shook it. Jessie followed with her claws, and Ash shook them as well. No one really knew what to say, so Ash took notice of his surroundings for the first time. They were in a small circular room, the statue standing sentinel in the center. It's us," Misty gasped, dashing over to it. Ash ran with her and touched the cold stone forehead of the figure that resembled him. The whole statue was like new, a seemingly fresh coat of paint defining every detail. There were even two Pokemon figures that hadn't been on the original. One a Pikachu, the other clearly a Meowth. The rest looked exactly like each of his friends who had inherited the powers. "Hey, pretty good likeness of me," Pikachu said. Ash smiled at his friend. He'd have a much clearer idea of his personality now that he could speak. The room had a nauseatingly high ceiling with long, thin windows extending up to the rafters. Sunlight filtered in and came to rest lazily on the cold cobblestone floor. "Is this like a church or something?" Brock asked. Jesse elbowed James in the ribs. "Fly up there and see what's outside," she said, pointing to the high windows. James flinched in mild pain and scowled. "Why don't we just go outside?" he asked, annoyed. "Because we don't know what's out there," Jesse answered. James spread his wings and began beating them furiously, but to no avail. He just managed to kick up the thin layer of dust coating the floor. He laughed nervously and ran a hand through his hair. "I guess I have to get the hang of these things," he said, a rather large sweat drop sliding down the side of his face. Jessie rolled her eyes. "I guess you can't teach a new bird old tricks," she sighed. Ash took a deep breath and exited the room. He came to another room where an altar stood in the very far corner. It was delicately carved with intricate swirling patterns depicting a war. He walked over to it and ran his fingers along the groves deepened by age. Surprisingly, the fire that laced his arms and legs did not ignite the ancient wood. He shrugged. It must have been like the Ponaida he'd once ridden. He could burn things only if he wanted to. Ash continued to scrutinize the altar, and the rest filed outside. "Where are we? What is this place?" he heard Misty say. Ash finally managed to draw himself away from the place of reverence and walked outside. They were on a secluded shoreline, the temple being on a large escarpment. James closed his eyes and spread the majestic blue wings again. "What might I ask are you doing?" Jesse asked. "It's a beach. Perfect place to try and fly again," James replied, stepping to the edge. He took a deep breath and leapt off. Jessie shrieked as she saw him disappear below the edge. "James!" she cried, rushing to where he had jumped. She knelt and sighed exasperatedly as she watched him flutter weakly downwards. He lost his breeze several feet from the ground and slid roughly into the fine white sand. "Are you okay?" Jessie called through cupped hands. James got up swiftly and folded his wings back in. "I'm Fine. I meant to do that," he called. Misty chuckled to herself. Ash smiled. Jessie and James weren't so bad after all. "I think we'd better find a way to get him back up here," Pikachu pointed out. "He's certainly not flying," Brock added. Meowth sighed at the pathetic humans and began climbing down the cliff. It wasn't very steep, being one that had been carved by the sea. Meowth? Wait for me, Jesse called, clambering down after the agile cat. Ash shrugged to his friends, and they followed. James saw the rest of the group descend to meet him, and he met Jesse and Meowth halfway. Don't scare me like that again, Jesse said with a smirk upon reaching her friend. James smiled and winked. Ash couldn't help but notice how they acted towards each other when they thought no one was watching. There was no doubt in his mind they were the best of friends. But could there be more there? Only time would tell, as they assumed the proper indifferent attitude as he and his friends caught up with Team Rocket. Misty took one look at the ocean and left the group as they discussed what to do. She slipped off her shoes to discover her feet were webbed and clawed, just as her hands now were. She tossed the sneakers up a little so they wouldn't get wet and tested the water with her foot. She sighed happily and closed her eyes as she tentatively slid her entire foot in. Ever since she had been a little girl, she had wanted to be able to glide through the water effortlessly like her favorite Pokemon. Now she knew she had the power, and she dove into the surf vivaciously. She closed her eyes against the stinging salt water, and with a powerful push of her streamlined tail, she swam out far enough to have freedom of movement. She opened her eyes carefully to discover she had another adaptation to the water. She could see as clearly as when she was on land. Her throat also was slatted with gills. She smiled and dove down to the white bottom. She touched the sand, and it rose in a vague cloud of white in the clear blue water. Misty reeled back in surprise as something whizzed past her head. Neon, it cried, making itself visible. It was a tiny seahorse creature, only it shimmered in all the colors of the rainbow. Upon seeing Misty, it cocked its head to one side quizzically. Neon? Misty laughed and rocketed to the surface. She gasped in the air through her mouth and closed the gills. I could get used to this, she mused. Ash looked to the sea and heaved a sigh of relief when Misty came back out of it. Misty, don't disappear like that, please. We need to figure out where in God's name we are, and we don't need to be losing people, Ash reprimanded. Misty simply smiled and looked back to the water, where the Neon leapt gracefully out of the water and dove back in with a great splash. The first thing we should do is get off this beach, Jesse announced. The rest of the group nodded silently in agreement and began walking along the shore, firmly convinced that they'd find an easier way than climbing back up the cliff. James flapped his wings continually during the walk, trying desperately to figure out exactly how they were used properly. He never did, only succeeding in getting about a foot off the ground. James, will you kindly knock it off? Jessie asked as she was whapped firmly in the face by a flurry of cerulean feathers. James gave up and folded his wings back where they belonged. Soon, the group came to a low bank where they could easily get off the beach. Misty whispered goodbye to the ocean and the little Pokemon she had seen there, and allowed Ash to help her up over the small hill. Oh my God, she breathed, cupping her hands over her mouth. Before her lay a beautiful world. Ash recognized it as the same one he'd seen on the map. The same mountain range loomed to the north, and directly in front of them lay the ruins of a city. Let's go check out, Pikachu yelled, bounding forward. What? Why? It could be dangerous, Pikachu. Ash called after him. There could be survivors. It doesn't look like it was destroyed too long ago, he retorted. Ash's mind cleared with realization and began to follow. The rest of the travelers came along as well. They came to the great gates of the city and stopped respectfully. Welcome to Aqualeak. Jesse read the sign discerningly. Welcome to what's left of Aqualeak, Meowth added. Pikachu stopped when he realized no one was following him as he had asked. Come on, he called and took off again, already beginning to scan the ruins of the first house. Ash followed to search the house with Pikachu while Misty and Brock took another, and Jesse, James, and Meowth went off to search on their own. The wind whistled across the land, the silence drilling a hole in Ash's mind. It was positively unnerving. It was the silence of a great tragedy, a beautiful lifestyle coming to a brutal end. Closing his eyes, Ash could see it, the people working side by side peacefully every day. They talked happily of their daily lives, sometimes a bad event, but nothing really tragic. Store owners practiced their craft unmolested and provided a decent service. Then, his vision turned dark as hordes of soldiers destroyed the once peaceful city. Something creaked, groaned loudly under pressure, and fell, startling the tense Pikachu. For the first time, the loneliness of this new world set into Ash's mind, causing a shudder to run up and down his spine. "Hello, is anyone here?" Pikachu called. No answer came, so he looked remorsefully at Ash and bounded to the next set of debris. The youth turned to follow, but stopped as a hand exploded from the rubble and quickly entwined itself around his ankle. He shrieked in terror and drew back apprehensively, only succeeding in tripping himself. "Please me," a masculine voice asked. Ash peeled the fingers off of his leg, careful as not to burn them, and began clearing away the charred bits of wood and other household items. "Don't worry, I'll get you out, just hold on," he called valiantly. Pikachu heard the struggle and directed his attention to where the racket was coming from. He gasped as he saw Ash struggling with a young man, trying to free him. "I'm coming, Ash," he yelled, and soon he was by his friend's side, clearing the smaller bits away with his paws. Ash clenched his teeth, and the youth began to respond to him, opening his eyes and reaching out to Ash, who took his arms and dragged him free of the prison. "Thank you," the man said slowly. Ash laid him down gently, cradling the upper portion of his body. "What happened here?" Ash asked. The young man moaned in pain and squeezed his eyes shut, clutching his side. Pikachu put a paw to the youth's stomach and pulled it back bloodstained. Ashy muttered, showing him. Ash winced in sympathy and looked carefully at the young soul. He wasn't much older than a teenager, raven black hair pulled haphazardly behind his head. "But now we'll rise into power again. Find other resistance groups. We need you. We cannot survive on our own. Please avenge all those who died in vain," he muttered, and his eyes slid shut. Ash let his head turn to one side, letting the blood that had accumulated there flow out. Ash lowered his limp form to the ground and crossed his arms respectfully over his chest. "He's gone," he whispered. "What did he mean by resistance groups?" Pikachu asked. Ash shrugged. "I don't know, but I don't think we're going to find." "Wrong." Ash looked up to see the rest of his companions. Jesse and James stood close to each other, Meowth at their feet. It was Misty who had spoken, standing closest to him, but she moved aside to let Brock step forward. He cradled a young girl in his stone arms, blood dripping from a gash in her forehead. "We found her. She needs help," Misty said. James looked thoughtfully at the corpse on the ground and knelt by it. "You won't mind if I borrow this," he said, backing up as not to get his blue jeans he wore instead of the white uniform stained with the small puddle of red that was collecting beneath the body. He took his coarse wool shirt and ripped a small clean bit from the hem. He folded it into a neat square and pressed it against the little girl's head. She groaned and pressed herself farther into Brock's body. Jessie's ears suddenly pricked up, and she looked sharply to the side. She could have sworn she heard something snap. She looked towards the direction of the sound and saw a shadowy figure with what looked like a bow and arrow aimed directly at Ash's skull. "Ash, look out!" she gasped, and in a split second, Ash heard the twang of the bow and watched as an arrow sped towards him. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable pain of the tip piercing vulnerable flesh. When none came, he opened one eye cautiously to see that the arrow was suspended in air before him. It began glowing a bright blue and dropped to the ground inches in front of his face. "To save him?" Ash exhaled forcefully and looked to Jessie, whom he was sure had spoken. She had a strained look on her face and had her hand outstretched toward him. "Well, I guess we know what Jessie's power is now," James mused, adjusting his wings. He was constantly fiddling with them. Ash guessed it was either because he wasn't used to it or he wanted to show them off. The shadow that had fired the arrow leapt down from the remains of a brick wall on which it had stood. He silently and slowly slunk tentatively from the shadows. It was an old man, with grayed hair and ragged clothing. His small eyes widened upon seeing the girl who rested in Brock's arms. "Melinda!" he cried, dashing over quite quickly for such an old-looking man, and greedily snatched the girl from Brock's arms. No one minded the man taking the child. They were relieved to have someone to ask questions to. "Excuse me, sir. Could you please tell us what happened here?" Jessie called. "You should know you caused it." The haired man snapped. Everyone exchanged confused glances before turning back to the man. "We couldn't possibly have, sir. You see, we've only been here a very short time, and let me guess, you need a place to stay." where the girlies can primp their pretty red hair and the men can get drunk and slobber all night. He spat derisively. Jessie looked momentarily hurt by the comment about her hair, but quickly changed, lunging forward and griping the man's arm. She whipped her tail about angrily and stared into his eyes. "Please tell us," she hissed, trying to control her anger. You are the root of this. The rebellion is useless now. I won't tell you anything. Leave us alone," he cried, tearing a dagger from his ragged cloak. He drew it swiftly across Jessie's face. A tiny red spray leapt from her skin as hard metal sliced into mortal flesh. She cried out and reeled back in pain. "Jessie, no!" James cried, catching her. He cradled her gently as he watched the color drain from her face and the life leave her eyes as she passed out in his arms. The old man set the unconscious youth on the ground and smoothed her hair back reverently. He suddenly began sobbing and raised the dagger high in the air. "I'll end this for us now, Melinda dear," he hissed through clenched teeth and violently plunged the dagger into the child's chest. Misty shrieked at the sight of such a brutal murder. "Oh, dear God," she groaned, burying her face in Ash's shoulder. The thought of deliberately and ruthlessly murdering someone, be it child or adult, sickening her. As the blood seeped away from the small body, the killer looked up at Ash through wild eyes and slowly stood to his full height. "No more will I endure this torment," he proclaimed, rising the dagger above his head once again. He brought it down in a wide arc, ending through his own stomach. His eyes widened in pain, the realization of what he had done hitting his psyche with tremendous force. A single tear ran down his cheek as he coughed up a mouthful of blood and collapsed to the ground. Ash carefully slid 2 fingers beneath Melinda's chin. Feeling nothing, he closed his eyes and shook his head somberly. Misty gasped and looked away, the tears streaming down her pale blue cheeks. "Jessie, are you okay? Answer me, Jessie." James' panicky voice was heard above all other noises. He was cradling her inert form in his lap, blood streaming from the shallow cut along her cheek. He wiped it away with his thumb and ran a hand through her hair affectionately. "Is she all right?" Misty asked with genuine concern and knelt by her side as well. Jessie's eyes squeezed shut harder, then they fluttered open. What happened?" she groaned, putting a hand to her cheek. James smiled, relieved his friend was okay, and helped her up, embracing her briefly as he did so. Jessie seemed mildly amused by the furtive show of affection and smiled crookedly at her friend. "I'm glad you're all right," he said, cleaning the fresh blood away. "Thanks for being worried about me," she replied slyly. Brock stood by the bodies of the 2 disturbed people, deeply moved by what had happened. Misty noticed his forlorn look as they began to leave the village. "Brock, come on, let's go," she said softly, tugged him away. His eyes remained fixed upon the people who'd once had happy lives, but were forced to die in the end. They'd had lives, the child had parents, and the old man had to have had a family. He turned over his shoulder sadly and followed his companions. Jessie felt her knees weaken, still dizzy from having fainted, and she sunk slowly to her knees. James saw her struggle, knelt, and allowed Jessie to put her arm over his shoulders. He stood, supporting her weight, and helped her walk out of the city. "What we do now, Ash?" Misty asked as they slowly strolled away. "Try to find another town, I guess," he said, also deeply moved by the double suicides. Misty sighed, but turned around as a quiet voice called out to them. "Wait, please, do not leave." The group whirled around to see an ancient Oriental man in a flowing crimson robe standing at the outskirts of Aqualique. It buttoned up all the way to his chin and had long and overly wide sleeves. He stood with both hands inside them and bowed to the voyagers. "I am honored to be in your presence. Please, if you need a place to stay, come with me," he said. He, like Mr. Lau, spoke with a heavy Japanese accent, but this man had only the long, thin mustache. The beard was absent. Ash, without saying a word, followed the man. Misty instinctively followed, as did the rest. He led them silently to a small cabin on the shores of the great ocean that bordered the continent. Not a word was said the whole trip. Jessie was getting used to her new, acute, cat-like hearing, swearing she heard a wind chime. No one believed her until they came to the old man's house. A set of silver chimes, shaped like odd Pokemon, dangled from a hunk of polished driftwood. It was a rather large home, crafted out of clay bricks, obviously fashioned with a base of beach sand. Ash wondered how it continued to stand being near a moist environment, but didn't ask. "Please, come in," the man said and bowed, allowing the group to enter before him. James scanned the room quickly and soon found what he was looking for. He located and immediately led Jessie to a small sofa which sat in the center of the room. She sat down heavily, and James accompanied her along with Meowth. The man walked over to see if they were quite all right and noticed the blood still seeping from a slash. "Ah, I'll get you something to clean that up," the man said, gesturing towards the wound. Jessie sighed in fatigue and closed her eyes. James wrapped his arms around his companion and eased her into a reclining position, her head resting against his shoulder. He rested his head against hers and closed his eyes as well. He buried his face in Jessie's glossy red hair and breathed in deeply. It smelled like flowers, and he smiled as she lifted her face up. Her nose touched his chin briefly, and she settled back down. James smiled contentedly and settled himself. Misty put a hand to her chest and sighed. "They're so cute when they aren't acting evil," she whispered. Ash looked at Misty, stunning with a long, beautiful tail. "If only you knew Misty," he whispered under his breath. The old man returned from the back of his home with a terracotta dish of water, some bandages, and some ointment. He walked briskly over to the pair on the sofa, tapped James on the shoulder, and set the supplies on the floor. James opened his eyes suddenly and nodded thanks to the old man upon seeing the dish. He reached down, picked up a bandage, and dipped it in the water. He brushed a non-existing hair away from the cut and dabbed it tenderly with the folded cloth. Jessie opened her eyes as she felt the cold dampness of the cloth and smiled at James. "Feeling better?" he asked her. She nodded and took the cloth from James to finish herself. Ash, Misty, and Brock seated themselves at the large table in the room that was obviously the kitchen. "Welcome to my humble home. My name is Lotus. Welcome to my home," he said, bowing. Ash raised an eyebrow. "Lotus? As in a flower?" he asked. "Yes, it is a beautiful name, yes. May I offer you something to drink?" Lotus asked, shuffling to a wooden cabinet. "No thanks. By the way, I'm Ash," he mumbled. "Just some water, and I'm Misty," she answered. Lotus came back with a carved wooden glass full of water and handed it to Misty. "Brock, and those two would be Jessie and James," he said, extending his stone palm for Lotus to shake. Misty took the water gratefully and put the glass to her lips, letting the cool liquid slide down her parched throat. She looked to the main living room to see Jessie and James, both sound asleep on the sofa, James' wing wrapped protectively around both of them. "Magnificent," Lotus breathed, walking over to James. "Simply gorgeous," he added, stroking the longest feather tip. "You're all just as I suspected." Misty finished the water and pushed the glass to the center of the wooden table. It was a deep red and shiny with age, the grain showing beautifully. "Heh, too bad he can't use them," she mused, pushing her chair away from the table and getting up. "Well, I don't expect any of you are in any condition to fight," Lotus said, plucking a loose feather from the middle of the great cerulean wing. "Fight?" Brock raised an eyebrow. "Well, yes. That's why you came here, isn't it?" Lotus asked. Ash's stomach tied in a knot as he looked towards the setting sun. It would be night soon, his first night in this strange, foreign, and unforgiving new land. He stood and pushed his chair in. "Do you have any answers?" he demanded suddenly. "Ah, it depends on the question," Lotus answered, sitting in a cross-legged position on the floor. "Why are we here?" Pikachu asked, joining him. Lotus patted the woven grass mat that served as a carpet next to him and beckoned the friends to join him. "Come, and Master Lotus will answer all," he said, closing the thin eyes wisely. "Should I wake Jessie and James?" Misty asked. Ash shook his head. "They've had a hard day. Let them sleep," he answered. Misty smiled at the couple peacefully asleep on the sofa. Meowth, also asleep at their feet, and took a seat close to Ash. Lotus inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. He seemed peaceful and wise. Ash trusted him. Perhaps he'd gained a sixth sense with his powers of the flame, but he trusted Lotus, and he knew he was trustworthy. "Now, what do your young minds wish to know?" he asked. "What is this place? Brock asked. This is the world of Aradine. You are on the Karakash shore by the Neonthian Sea, Lotus answered. Neon, I saw one of those when I went swimming today, Misty exclaimed. Lotus seemed to understand what she was talking about and smiled warmly. Friendly little creatures, aren't they? He asked, lowering his eyes at her. Oh yes, and it was beautiful too, Misty said, closing her eyes happily. Legends have been told of a creature known as an Argon, the evolved form of a neon, which roam deep waters. Huge and fearsome, they resemble water dragons and are quick to devour humans. None have ever been seen. Still think the neons are so cute, Lotus said, smiling slyly at Misty. She blinked rapidly in bafflement and coiled her tail around herself for comfort. Oh well, she stammered. Lotus looked proud of himself. It was as if he already knew Misty. But you never see that much, do you, Ash? He asked. Ash laughed for the first time that day, finally beginning to relax. So how do we get here? He asked. You ended up in the temple, correct? Lotus asked. Ash nodded. Well, this is a world of magic. Open your heart. Learn to accept things that you never thought possible. Just take a look at yourself, and you'll know what I mean, Lotus explained. Ash looked to the great blazing tail behind him and the flames along his arms and legs, and understood. All doubt he had in his mind cleared, he understood. What is our purpose? He asked, being more assertive than need be. He felt the surge of a world in turmoil rise in him. He felt the cries for help. He felt the pain. He knew which was the right question to ask. Lotus looked deep into his eyes and saw the fire of the heroes burning in the backs. He knew already. He looked to Misty. She knew. Brock and the young Pokemon knew. They all had the fire he thought had perished long ago. He closed his eyes. Jesse and James didn't even have to be awake for him to know they knew as well. You, my friends, are the 7 powers. What? Us? Misty shrieked. You are the chosen ones. You are destined to do great things. You are all part of the legend. Will you stay and help us? Lotus asked, taking Misty's hand gingerly. She drew it away, closing her eyes remorsefully. Ash opened his mouth to speak, but Misty cut him off. Before you go and throw yourself into another dangerous situation without thinking, hear me out. You had dreams, Ash. You wanted to be Pokemon Master. You still do, and you are so close. Are you going to give up those dreams to risk your life for a world you've never lived in, never will live in? And what about your mom, Ash? I bet everyone back home is thoroughly convinced we're dead. What about my sisters? What about Brock's dad and all of his brothers and sisters? We have loved ones and dreams. Think about that. Misty preached him slowly, standing up. I'll do it. She turned to see James leaning over the edge of the sofa. What? She asked, bewildered. I'm in. I'll do it, he replied matter-of-factly. Misty knelt and looked deep into James' emerald eyes. They told her of pain and longing and the desire to do something great. You're really serious, aren't you? Why, James? Why so quickly? She asked, never removing her gaze from his. James slid his eyes shut slowly and took a deep breath. I don't have anything at home worth going back for, he answered. Misty remembered. She remembered when she'd been at his childhood home, and the cruelty of his parents and that awful girl they'd wanted him to marry. The only things I had were Jesse and Meowth, and they're here with me. You guys too, if you're willing to be friends, James said, extending his hand to Misty. She smiled. James had a good heart, despite his evil intentions beforehand. They hadn't been real. He hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, just please his boss and earn a living. Now that he didn't have to do that, he was actually very kind to Ash and his friends. Misty took James' hand and shook it firmly. Friends, James, she said, honestly meaning it. Ash stood and vigorously shook James' hand as well, followed by Brock. Nice to finally be friends after all these months, Pikachu exclaimed, leaping joyously into James' lap. I'll do it too. Jesse's groggy response startled all who hadn't known she was awake. And I'm willing to bury the hatchet, just as long as I don't have to be emotional for very long, she mused. Ash laughed. Same Jesse, only now her fiery attitude could be used as a benefit. There was silent communication between all present. Any obstacles that had stood in the way of their friendship were now crushed to the ground. Get some sleep. Training begins tomorrow, Lotus said and began extinguishing candles. Well, going to do it? Misty asked. Ash smiled. his flames flaring brightly for a split second. I thought so. And I'm with you 100%, she whispered, lowering her voice. Good night, Misty, Ash whispered back. She giggled and tossed onto the blankets Lotus had brought out for them his way. It struck right on target and unfolded, enveloping Ash in a cloud of coarse fabric. He gasped in surprise and smiled at Misty, who blushed a darker blue and unfurled a blanket for herself. Pikachu and Brock had already found a warm corner by the dwindling fire and gone to sleep. Ash crept around to the front of the sofa and gently spread the blanket over Jesse and James, who had since fallen asleep again. Good night, team. Well, I guess I can't call you that anymore. Good night, my friends, he whispered and lightly brushed the stray hair out of James' face that always seemed to be there. He didn't stir, and Ash crept back to receive his own bedding. Misty had set it out for him, and Ash was stunned. Normally, she did things for herself only. He would be stunned yet again when he saw exactly how close together she'd put the blankets. Ash didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed being able to sleep so close to her. He crept quietly to the soft, makeshift bedding and pulled the woven blanket over his flame-infused body. He was correct in his assumption before. If he wanted to burn something, we was positive he could. He just really didn't know how. He turned over slowly, ever so slowly as not to disturb the young girl who lay beside him. He lay facing Misty, watching her chest rise and fall and listening to her soft breathing, and smiled. You know you're beautiful when you sleep, Misty, he whispered to himself. He raised one hand cautiously and deftly ran it through her hair once. She whispered something in her sleep and turned over. Good night, Misty, Ash whispered and closed his eyes. Sleep came easily that night, despite the stress of the day's events, and Ash slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. Ash! Get up, Ash! Don't make me shock you. Ash's eyes snapped open at the threat of his Pokemon. I'm up. I'm up already, he cried, leaping out of the blanket, not wanting an electrocution first thing in the morning. Good, the others are outside. Let's go, Pikachu exclaimed, skittering quickly out the door, his claws clicking on the hard floor. Ash stretched and yawned, the flames that had died down to a soft blue in color with sleep flaring to the brilliant orange they had been. He looked out a nearby window to see James falter in midair and crash to the ground. Lotus sighed and rolled his eyes visibly. James, you are not using the winds to your advantage. Now try again, he heard Lotus say. James grumbled and picked himself up, fluttering his wings to relieve them of the sand. Ash chuckled to himself and slowly walked out of the house. Everyone was standing in a rough semicircle outside in the sand, their eyes directed upward. Ash joined them and looked in the direction they were. James was standing on the roof of the large adobe house, wings spread and knees bent, waiting to leap off. You can do it, James, the first believe in you, Jesse called jokingly. Ha ha, he answered and jumped. He rose shakily into the air, beating the great wings furiously. No, glide, soar, use the wind, Lotus called. James stopped the incessant fluttering and spread his wings to their fullest length. He sailed a few feet before taking a dramatic plunge. Instinctively with the fear, he drew his wings in and fell like a normal human would, landing with a great spray of sand on the beach. He lay there for a moment, unmoving, then slowly pushed his upper body off of the sand. He took one look at his wings, sprawled haphazardly across the glittering white sand, pounded his fist into it angrily, and buried his forehead into the hot grains. Oh, someone's ego has been wounded, Jessie mused, assuming her normal acidic attitude. My ego is fine, thank you very much, James replied, getting up. He brushed his shirt off and folded his wings back in respectfully. Jessie rolled her eyes as James trotted briskly back to the group. Now, you will now refer to me as Master Lotus, and I will train you to use your powers. I have read much of the old legends and know nearly all there is about the 7 powers, he said, slowly scrutinizing each person present. Ash, you have the power of the flame. Use it wisely. Misty has the power of water and ice. These, paired with others, could be a devastating force. Brock, the power of fighting. With a rock-hard defense, you will make a formidable opponent. Pikachu, as you call him, Ash, has the power of lightning. You don't know this, but if I am correct, your powers have increased. Meowth, with the normal ability of agility and speed, you'll also find your powers have increased. James has the power of flight. Well, at least he will have the power of flight. This will make you a valuable asset to the team as well as a fierce warrior. Finally, Jesse has been gifted with the power of the mind. This is one of the more difficult powers to learn, but once mastered, you will be a powerful force. Training will be hard, but the rewards will be great. Now, all who are in this, put your hands in the center of the circle. Master Lotus finished his grand opening speech, leaving all present speechless. He slowly lowered his ancient, wrinkled hand into the center of the group. Jesse's and James' hands soon followed. Meowth had a bit of a problem, as did Pikachu due to height, but Ash and James solved it, allowing the Pokémon a spot on their shoulders. Brock was the last, seeming very hesitant to join. Well, Brock? Misty asked, raising one eyebrow. Brock's memory flashed with images of his little brothers and sisters, of his mother and father, and the fond memories of the times before she passed away. He had a family to live for, but his father had promised him he'd take care of the siblings. He had told him to go and accomplish his dream, and one dream was to do something great. This was his chance. I'm in, he said, placing his stone hand atop all the others. Brock looked up into the smiling emerald eyes of James. He seemed very friendly to him, like a soul who'd longed for a friend other than Jesse and Meowth, and was finally getting them. Even Jesse winked at him when his gaze met hers. He knew that this was what he wanted to do, and he'd see it through to the end. All right then, James, back to the roof. I will be working solely with him for a while. The rest of you, the first thing to do is get to know your new forms. I want you to look carefully at anything new about yourselves and experiment. I have to whip this young man into shape, Master Lotus said, and parted the circle to get to James. He took him by the arm and led him behind the house. Ash shrugged and walked to the shoreline with Misty. James sighed as he approached the back of the house where the wooden ladder stood. Now, you'll never soar with the Talcons with that attitude, Master Lotus said, urging him upwards. Talcon? What's that? He asked, stalling the inevitable. It's a great bird Pokemon. You'll see one sooner or later. Now climb, he replied, tugging James' tail feathers roughly. James clenched his teeth angrily and placed his foot on the first rung. He looked up nervously to the sky where the sun was just climbing to the noon slot and pressed onward. He took the steps carefully, feeling each one beneath his feet to take up more time. He was not anxious to fall flat on his face again. Stop stalling, James. You need to learn to fly sooner or later. He heard Master Lotus call. Yeah, whatever, he mumbled. I heard that. James swallowed hard and quickly ascended the last few steps. Upon reaching the very edge of the roof, he unfolded his wings and spread them. Master Lotus came huffing up the ladder after him and stopped, breathing hard. I'm much too old to be doing this, he mumbled, walking over to the young man at the edge. James turned around, not bothering to close his wings, and waited for the old man to come to his side. Well, you seem to know all. What should I do? He asked, folding his arms across his chest stubbornly. Master Lotus closed his eyes and shook his head as he walked calmly over to the youth. He gently pried his arms apart and spread them along the lengths of his wings. James opened his mouth slightly in wonderment and listened to what the wise man had to say. The beach is the place of the winds. You must learn to sense their patterns, know them as well as you know your friend Jesse. They can either be your friend or your enemy. Now, close your eyes, James. Feel with your heart and soul. Listen what the winds tell you, he said. James closed the emerald eyes and thrust his neck out into the air. The wind whistled softly through his blue hair and tossed it lazily about his face. Something was there, something he'd never really taken the time to feel for before. It was like a quiet voice in the back of his mind, telling him, and only him, secrets that it picked up, but most of all it told him where it was going. He began following the wind patterns with one hand, standing perfectly straight, his only movements following the wind. Yes, you feel it now. Use the wind. It is your most valuable asset, Master Lotus said, pressing his hands together with satisfaction. James opened his eyes and pushed his toes over the edge. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it, he repeated to himself, and readied his mind in majestic wings. James took a deep breath and jumped gracefully off of the house. He felt the pull of the winds and where they were going, but he could not sense how to ride them. He panicked slightly, fluttering his wings, but when he didn't fall, he stopped. He lost his concentration on the winds, focusing mainly on his wings, and sailed haphazardly to the ground. He didn't make a crash landing, fortunately, and lighted in the sand on both feet. Well, it's a start, he muttered to himself. Master Lotus, unbeknownst to James, had come down to meet him. He walked calmly behind him and laid a hand on his shoulder. You lost touch with the wind. When you learn to meld all the elements of flight in your mind, then you will take to the skies, he said. James nodded, and Master Lotus proceeded to help another for the day. James sighed. He'd never learned to fly at this rate. He looked up at the beautiful coastline scenery and noticed something he hadn't before. A large rocky cliff rose not too far from the adobe house. A devious grin crept onto his face as an idea entered his brain. Perhaps my problem is I'm not starting high enough, he said to himself, and started off towards the cliff. Jesse noticed him walking away and peered cautiously from the safety of the beach just in front of their home. Whatever is he doing? Pikachu asked curiously. I don't know, but it can't be good. We'd better follow him, Ash, who saw them staring, said. Jesse and Pikachu nodded mutually, and Ash led the group towards the cliff. James finished his ascent up the sloping back of the cliff and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He closed his eyes and stood rigid. Ever so slowly, his right hand moved away from his body and began to move with the direction of the wind as James sensed it. After a few minutes, when he felt ready, he unfolded his wings and stepped slowly out to the very edge. He peered over and immediately drew his wings back in again. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, he whispered to himself. He wrapped his arms tightly around him in embarrassment and turned on his heel. He felt ashamed that here he was, supposedly this great hero, and he couldn't even stand at the edge of a cliff, much less jump off, and he was the one with the wings. He hung his head as he walked, upset and fearful of what everyone would think of him. That is, until Jesse's shoes became visible. He gasped and closed his eyes in fear. "Oh, James," Jesse called in a sing-song voice. James looked up slowly at Jessie, who stood with her arms crossed impatiently across her chest. "I know it's frustrating not being able to fly yet, but you don't have to go this far," she said, eyeing the ground. She herself walked over to the edge and looked down. James felt the shame again. She could look, and he could not. "Jesse, leave him alone," Ash said. James looked up again to see Ash and Pikachu come up as well. He must have seen the burning red color in James' cheeks and decided to defend him. "Ah, come on. He's just being a wimp," Jesse said, laughing. James could practically feel himself shrinking. Ash glared at the red-haired girl, dipping her foot over the edge lower and lower in mockery. Jessie discontinued when she felt Ash's eyes burning into her skull. She put her hands angrily on her hips and rolled her eyes. If James was ever going to learn, it wasn't going to be easy. "Come on, Ash. I bet I could jump off of here and land on my feet," she said, laughing louder than was really necessary. Ash's heart skipped as she jumped and twirled on the very edge of the cliff, sending several large chunks of it to plummet to the ground. "Jesse, I wouldn't." "Oh, now you're being a baby too?" She stood on one foot, raising one, just her toes, on the same edge, which was getting rather thin due to her antics. Pikachu's acute hearing, even more so than Jesse's, picked up a loud snap. Concerned, he looked to the area where Jesse stood just in time to watch a great crack shoot across like lightning and the tip of the cliff crumble and fall, taking her with it. "No!" he cried, reaching out. James whirled around and sprinted to the edge, and without even having to think, dove off of the edge after his friend. "I thought he couldn't fly," Pikachu gasped. "He can't," Ash replied. Jessie closed her eyes, mentally running through her last thoughts. She felt the wind rushing around her, faster and faster as she approached the ground. "I'm sorry, James," a memory. Her first day in the Team Rocket uniform, the first time she saw James, her Arbok, a devilish image of her mother. "You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be like your father." A little girl crying, young James, half frozen in the snow, thinking he was dead, a loyal Growlithe never leaving his side. Cassidy, a malevolent specter, Pikachu shocking her. A more pleasant memory, sitting with James after a defeat. It's okay, Jesse, there's always tomorrow. The mallet resulted from that remark. I love you. The memories and meaningless words flashed through her mind. So this is what people go through before death. I'm going to die. Her giddy mind projected near useless thoughts in its final moments. She imagined hitting the sand, every bone in her body shattering, the warm blood. She waited. She sensed the ground close below her and prepared herself for the impact. She did hit something, but it wasn't the ground. She squeezed her eyes shut harder as she felt a rush of hot air from underneath her, carrying a stinging spray of sand with it. She gasped as it whipped across her exposed skin, digging into it like hot needles. When no other pain came and her stomach lurched with the force of being carried upward, she opened her eyes. She found herself in James' arms, soaring into the sky. He had a determined, hard-set expression on his face and didn't even notice when Jesse came back to the world of the living. She slid her arms around his neck for stability, and James seemed to snap out of his trance. "James, you did it!" She cried happily. He looked down at his friend and smiled. "Tooted, didn't I?" He shouted happily. At that moment, a permanent bond was made between James and the winds. They would forever be on his side, and he would always know their patterns. He knew how to fuse the elements in his mind now, and nothing could stop his power of flight. Ash and Pikachu were forced to duck as James rocketed past the edge of the cliff. He performed a lissom flip midair and landed gracefully in front of them. He set Jesse down in front of the bewildered Ash and Pikachu and took off again, gilding with great speed towards the house. "Misty, you're quite an agile swimmer, but you have the power to use the water as well." Master Lotus stood in front of Misty, who was frolicking happily in the water. She noticed an odd shadow on the water and looked up to see James hovering a few feet behind him. "Master Lotus," Misty gasped, pointing behind him. He didn't turn. He knew who was there. "Very good, James. I see you know the winds now," he said, not bothering to turn around. James smiled proudly and slowly let himself drop. Misty smiled back at him and winked. "I found out I could do something pretty cool. It's not much, but would you like to see?" she asked. Master Lotus seemed to perk up and nodded vigorously. Misty blushed modestly and turned to face the ocean. She drew in a deep breath and slowly closed her eyes. Raising her hand out to the water, it began to shimmer with a deep blue haze. The mist coiled itself around Misty's body, leading with small points of light. They looked like miniature fireflies, streaking the air with cerulean paint. Suddenly, Misty flashed with the mist, and it dispersed, leaving her standing, her figure composed entirely of water. She dove down into the liquid azure sea, completely invisible to James and Master Lotus. "Whoa," James breathed. Master Lotus clapped his hands together with joy. "Oh, Misty, that's wonderful," he shouted. The water rippled with colors, and Misty was visible again. "You really think so?" she asked sheepishly. All of a sudden, Ash came bounding over like a small child. Master Lotus watch," he cried and thrust a hand out. He squinted his eyes in concentration, and a meek flame exited and extinguished with a puff of gray smoke. "Isn't it great?" he said proudly. "Misty, Master Lotus," and James erupted into a fit of laughter. "That makes Misty look like a pro." James sputtered between laughs. Ash raised one eyebrow cynically, but shrugged and strolled away, the tiny flame leaping from his hand occasionally. "I guess Ash is going to need as much help as James did," Master Lotus mused. "Maybe more," James himself added with a smirk. Misty trudged out of the water, flipping a bit of water onto James with the broad end of her tail. He turned to follow, but found Jesse behind him. "Wait, can I talk to you?" she asked, stopping him. He looked to Master Lotus, who nodded and smiled. "I'll leave you two alone," he said, winking at James, who promptly blushed and turned back to Jesse. She looked downwards and twirled a finger in her long red hair absent-mindedly. "So, you wanted to say something?" James asked, digging his hands into the back pockets of his jeans. "Two just wanted to thank you for saving me," she said, her cheeks running red with color. "It's nothing I wouldn't do for a good friend," James replied. Jessie took one step forward and wrapped her arms around James. "Thank you," she whispered, James hugged her back and rested his cheek against hers. "You're welcome. You're my best friend, Jesse," he whispered back. "What was that for?" she asked with a small giggle, never leaving the embrace. "Just so you know," James replied. Jesse hugged him tightly once more and slipped out of his arms. James sighed contentedly and let her go. She slid her arms down his and squeezed both hands reassuringly before turning and walking towards the house where everyone was gathering for lunch. James turned to face the ocean, still imagining Jesse's warmth in his arms. The winds caressed him in their warmth and crispness for being near the sea. It blew a strand of glossy blue hair away from his face, sweeping along his cheekbone and entering his ear. They whispered a message to them that was for James and only James. "Yes, I know," he told them, "but she doesn't feel the same way." Ash mentally counted off the members of their group and discovered James missing. "Where's James?" he asked, scanning the shoreline. He heaved a sigh of relief as he spotted him, standing with his wings folded, tail wrapped around his legs and arms folded across his chest. He looked sad and depressed as he stared out to the glittering swells far out in the limitless ocean. "James!" Ash called. He seemed to snap out of his trance and turn around. Ash motioned for him to come, and he slowly walked back. He stalled, watching his feet leave deep imprints in the fine white sand. Ash rolled his eyes and went inside. James stopped and listened as the winds bade him farewell for the time being and played over his lips, seeming to kiss him. He closed his eyes and let the winds playfully say goodbye. When they had finished their display of affection, James wearily trudged inside. Everyone was seated around the glossy wooden table, enjoying some sort of odd fruit. James smiled as he realized Jesse had saved the seat next to her and took it gratefully. "What's wrong?" Misty asked, noticed James' unusual depressed attitude. "Nothing. Just a little tired, I guess," he replied. Master Lotus nodded to the bowl in the center of the table filled with a bright green pear-shaped fruit. "They're called Caracas fruit because they grow only here. They are wonderful," he said, taking a large bite out of one. James perked up at the mention of food and took one himself. It was sweet yet bitter at the same time, the waxy skin having no impact on the clear flavor as most fruits did. Everyone enjoyed the refreshing taste and ate many of them before returning outside to train some more. Master Lotus took it upon himself to help Ash, who seemed to be struggling a bit. Ash, refusing to believe he needed help, stomped out impatiently to a small flat rock close to the shoreline. "Fine, now what do I do?" he asked, folding his arms stubbornly across his chest. Master Lotus sat next to him and took his hand in his own. "Show me the flame," he said. Ash looked at him cynically, shrugged, and pointed his hand out towards the ocean. He concentrated hard, and a minuscule flame leapt from his hand for a brief instant. He sighed in exasperation, and he noticed Brock sparring with air. The strength he saw in the muscles rippling underneath the stone skin was utterly amazing. He looked past his longtime friend to see Jessie, concentrating hard on a spoon. It buckled under the force of her strong psychic mind, and she smiled triumphantly. James swooped down from aloft next to her, and Jessie displayed her bent spoon proudly. He took it and smiled down at her. Even Meowth and Pikachu were engrossed in a small Pokemon battle of their own. They had set aside any differences and had actually become quite good friends. Pikachu succumbed to Meowth's claws before retaliating with a quick swipe of his tail, which was writhing with electricity. Meowth cried out in pain, and they both fell to the ground, beaten by one another. Ash sighed and hung his head. "I can't do it," he muttered. He looked up as a large wave broke dangerously close to the rock. Misty stood with a webbed hand outstretched and a terrified look on her face. "Sorry," she called and disappeared under the surf. "I can't do it. Everyone else can use their powers, but not me." Ash moaned again. Seeing his distress, Master Lotus patted him affectionately on the back. "Listen to me, young Ash. Young is quite accurate, isn't it? You're younger than all your friends. It makes you feel inferior sometimes. The desire you have in your mind to be better is cutting off what your heart tells you. Let go of that thought. Listen to your heart," he said, looking intently at Ash's flame-laced body. Ash took a deep breath and closed his eyes. "Now, free my mind. Listen to the heart," he whispered. "Think of Misty," he said to himself in his mind. He slowly extended his hand and concentrated. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind. All of Gary, the way he had made him feel as a Pokemon trainer, inferior and worthless. He clenched his teeth. Those were the thoughts Master Lotus had told him to forget. Listen to the heart, he repeated. The heart, he whispered. An image of Misty appeared in his mind. She was wearing a flowing white silk gown that seemed suspended in air as it caressed her body. Her hair was down, and it hung far below her waist in a shimmering veil of red. She smiled and bounded away through a field of beautiful white flowers. She stopped halfway through as a veritable cloud of beautiful butterfree rose from the flowers. She turned around and laughed as the butterfly Pokemon danced about her in a fantasy display of glitter and shimmering wings, beckoning Ash to come with her. It was the dream Ash had had so many times before, and each time he felt as he ran toward her, he was caught in glue. She was running farther and farther away, and he wasn't getting anywhere. He'd call out her name. She'd call his back and ask him to come with her. Ash opened his eyes when he felt heat in his hand. He looked down to see a small, yet raging flame in his hand. He played with it, using both hands to mold it into a molten ball, then hurled it to the ground with a vengeance. It exploded with a fiery blast of heat and sand. Master Lotus flinched, momentarily blinded by the flames, and covered his face with his forearm. Ash blinked in surprise and looked at the scorched circle he'd left in the sand. "Did I do that?" he asked breathlessly. Master Lotus patted him firmly on the back again and stood up. "That, my boy, is how you use the gift of the flame," he said, walking toward the water to see how Misty was coming along. Ash stared dumbfounded at his hands. "Thank you, Misty," he whispered and stood up to practice some more. A few weeks passed at the adobe house by the sea. Ash became more talented at his craft, as did everyone else, teaching themselves how to use their powers. James actually became quite the agile flight expert, and he, Jessie, and even Meowth, the sharp-tongued Pokemon everyone had hated, had all become great friends. Jessie, too, though her sarcastic attitude and acidic personality remained, was friendly towards Ash and his friends. Master Lotus enjoyed watching them, teaching and nurturing them like they were his own children. He also knew that, like children, someday the group must leave to fulfill their part of the legend. Ash came in from training behind the house as beckoned by Misty. "Why, I'm starting to do so well," he complained loudly. Misty slapped a hand over his mouth forcefully. "Quiet. Master Lotus says he wants to talk to all of us, and it's important," she hissed. Ash nodded. "Now, are we going to listen respectfully?" Misty asked, her voice dripping with honey. "I went unless OULT go of mouth." Ash mumbled through Misty's webbed fingers. "If you promise I'll let you go," she said, grinning sadistically. Ash snarled and resorted to the last defense he had, licking Misty's palm. She shrieked and drew her hand away, swiftly wiping it on Ash's jacket. "You jerk! How dare you!" she yelled, pushing him backwards by the shoulders. He stumbled back, trying to regain his balance, but failed, tripping over Brock, who sat on the floor near Master Lotus. He landed on the floor on his back, staring up at the ceiling to regain his vision. Jessie appeared in his field of view, grinning like a child. "Have a nice trip?" she asked, using an ancient pun. Ash rolled his eyes and sat up. "Lover spat," Brock said. James snickered, as did Jessie and Meowth. "Lovers?" "Yeah, right," Misty said, taking her seat next to Brock. Ash groaned and slid to a spot in the rough circle. When Master Lotus was positive all were present, he sighed deeply and closed his eyes. "The time has come for you to leave," he started. Murmurs of protest arose from the group, and Pikachu leapt into his lap. "You're sending us away?" he asked, looking up with wavering black eyes. Master Lotus patted the young thing affectionately and set him on the floor. "You forget that you are part of the legend. You were sent here to help the world of Aradine, and that is what you shall do. I have limits on what I can teach you, and I have helped you all I can. It is time that you ventured out to begin your quest. I have something for each of you before you leave. Jessie, you shall receive yours first. Come with me." Master Lotus slowly stood and cautiously walked to the back of his home. Jessie looked to James for reassurance. He nodded with a smile, and she stood, following the path Master Lotus had taken. The door of her room she had never bothered to venture in stood ajar, a soft yellow light spilling forth from it. It cast its eerie presence on the ground, silently lurking. Jessie didn't have to have anyone tell her that that was her destination. She drew a short breath and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for what little light came from a candle. It reminded her very much of Mr. Lau's shop, except minus a few artifacts. The same kind of silk shrouds laced the ceiling, and the strong presence of incense lingered in the air. Master Lotus stood with his back to the red-headed girl over a bundle of something wrapped in leather. The rumbling intensified, and Ash's eyes snapped open as the ground exploded between him and the vine dragon, sending all present sprawling backwards to the ground. He saw Misty and Brock land on either side of him with a small shriek of surprise and pain. The dragon seemed pleased and thrust its head into the air, howling in victory or welcome. Ash looked up as the dust cleared to see a huge red object looming before him. It looked like several thick red quilts entwined around each other with green leaves around the base. A flower? Ash couldn't be sure. It resembled a young rose bud multiplied in size thousands of times, the petals thick and leathery with the strength of the strongest metal. What is that thing? Pikachu croaked. I'll show you soon enough, peasant. Everyone jumped at the honey-coated voice emanating from the pod before them. It was then they heard the maniacal laughter for the first time, a sound that would haunt them for all their days in Aradine, the rest of their lives, and even in their dreams. Jessie sensed the air of evil around the flower bud. It reeked of malevolence and hatred, and she backed away fearfully. It began to unfold, releasing a cloud of glittering spores into the air. It uncoiled slowly, majestically, as if leaving whatever was in the center for them to see very last. When the petals had completely unfurled, the enormous rose served as a stage for the young woman who stood in the center. Long tendrils delicately curled about the entire profile of the foliage, glittering in the pale moonlight. One crimson appendage bent respectfully, allowing the flower's occupant to step down on a red carpet of sorts. The young woman herself was a deep emerald, vines adorned with leaves and flowers embracing her body lovingly. She wore a short dress that looked very much like a deep red tulip. She walked over tentatively, inspecting each person on the ground before her. Cocking her head to one side thoughtfully, she stooped down to the nearest person, which happened to be James, and hauled him roughly to his feet. He clenched his teeth in fear as she lowered her face seductively to his. Her eyes were filled with flames, and they glittered with an odd kind of red eyeshadow. Had the colors been less rich than they were, one would have thought she was wearing a cheap Christmas play costume. James recoiled in terror, and the maiden dropped him to the dust condescendingly. He yelped softly in pain and crawled backwards fearfully. Jessie received him kindly, wrapping her arms around his quaking shoulders in comfort. The woman snickered to herself and stood completely upright. Pretty lousy for the 7 great powers, if you ask me, she said, laughing spitefully. James looked hurt, and Ash decided he'd had enough of this woman, whoever she was. He stood boldly, his flames flaring with a furious intensity. And just who are you? He demanded angrily. The woman seemed amused by the question, running a hand through her long, glittery pink hair. Flowers grew in it, as did vines and beautifully crafted leaves. Why me? I am the legendary queen of Aradine. I am your worst nightmare, the rightful ruler of this world, and the most beautiful woman in the history of this planet. I am a great Weintraub, she exclaimed, thrusting her hands into the air. The winds howled a protest, and lightning from the storm gathering illuminated the dark landscape. I am also egotistical and conceited, Jessie muttered, mocking Weintraub under her breath. Only James, who pressed himself further into the security of her arms and wrapped his around her in reply to her friendly gesture, heard the sassy remark. You destroyed Aqualique. You killed all those people. You're not a queen. You're a monster. Ash yelled defiantly. Weintraub, hearing these bold and stupid words, turned her frosty glare, full of flames, to the youth. Watch it, boy. I have tortures far more agonizing than you could even begin to imagine. You would not die peacefully, I assure you, she hissed. The fear entered Ash's mind with those words, and he backed away hesitantly. Moving for the first time, the vine dragon stepped forward, allowing Weintraub to stroke it lovingly. It seemed to purr with pleasure as a deep, contented growl rose from its throat. Good boy. You twerps should provide an interesting toy for my pet here, she mused. Jesse and James' voices quavered in unison as they clung to each other, as usual for comfort. Ash. Misty whispered his name for comfort. The beautiful beast looked longingly at his prey, waiting for the moment his master would set him loose to devour it. Jesse could sense the evil in this, as well as the queen. A surge of excited energy emanated from it, which nearly knocked her free of senses. Run! She shrieked, sensing the dragon was ready to attack. Upon hearing her shrill cry, James sprung to his feet, hauling Jesse with him. Ash, Misty, and Brock swiftly turned over their shoulders, following the initial people to flee. The last they heard of their beloved Pokémon was an anguished cry from Meowth and the zap of electricity from Pikachu. Ash stopped dead in his tracks. He knew the sound of a defense shock, and that had been one of them. Pikachu! He cried, reaching out. The Rose Dragon stood victoriously where the Pokémon had once been, thick crimson blood dripping grotesquely from its jowls. Meowth! Jesse and James cried. James felt tears sting at the corners of his eyes. Meowth had been one of his best friends. Jesse, too, felt the loss deeply already. It's too late, they're gone. Go! Now! Brock hollered, shoving Ash and Misty forward. Ash ran. He ran despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. He ran though it felt like breaking down and crying. He'd lost the first friend he'd ever had on his Pokémon journey. He'd filled the empty space Gary had left when he betrayed him. He helped take the edge off of his stress at trying to be the best all the time. He'd hoped with Pikachu he could rise to be the best, but not with cruel training, with knowing what was in each other's hearts and mutually fighting battles as one mind. Linked together, they could not and would not lose. The little electric rodent had been Ash's best friend, and now he was gone. The group ran until they thought they could run no more. The fear drove them, but presently, they discovered they were not being followed by the monster. They slowed slowly to a stop, taking short, labored breaths from exhaustion. Ash looked back. No trace of the fiend was discernible. It's gone? Misty breathed, fanning herself with her tail. Ash swallowed hard with a tight throat and slowly sank to his knees. Pikachu! He cried. He folded into a small, protected ball over his feet and wept bitterly. As if remembering what had happened, Misty and Brock both also burst into tears. They fell dramatically to the ground, wrapping their arms around Ash. He's gone. He's really gone. Ash wailed. Jesse and James stood silently, watching the group of friends attempt unsuccessfully to comfort each other. James closed his eyes slowly, letting the tear gathering in them fall. Meowth, he whispered. He looked out of the corners of his emerald eyes to see Jesse's lip quaver, and a tear slid down her cheek. This was a rare sight. Jessie was letting her emotions come to the surface. Jessie? James queried. Jessie slowly sunk to her knees, the near silent sobs racking her body. James let the tears fall freely as he knelt next to his friend. Oh, James, Meowth was the only friend I ever knew besides you. Jessie sobbed. I know. James wailed right along with her. He took her into his arms gingerly, and she wept onto his shoulder, her hand resting comfortably in the glossy blue hair. The peace was to be short-lived. Instantaneously, the ground erupted and the vine dragon stood before them, hate burning in the otherwise gorgeous rose eyes. Whipping its tail madly, it honed in on its next victims, narrowing its eyes at Jesse and James. Time seemed to move in slow motion for the blue-haired youth as he silently watched the dragon lunge in their direction. Dissy, no, he cried, shoving her out of reach. She let the momentum take her off to one side and instantly regretted it. James' pupils narrowed as the shadow of the beast descended at unfathomable speeds toward him, and the last Jesse heard of her winged companion was the crunch of the gravel and dirt blended with his blood-curdling scream as the predator disappeared beneath the earth with its prey. A morbid silence settled over the group as the death of yet another friend hung in the air. Jessie sat up from where she had fallen. The realization of what had happened sunk into her skull, percolating into her mind like a lethal poison. "No, no," she yelled, scrambling weakly over to the spot where the tragedy had occurred. All that was left was a few scattered blue feathers and a small puddle of blood. "James," she whispered to herself, picking up one of the larger feathers. As if in a final goodbye, it glittered a bright cerulean in the moonlight. Jessie traced it along her cheekbone longingly, letting the silky fibers caress the scar of the wound James had taken care of. "No, no, 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 no," Misty wailed, pounding her fists onto the ground. Jessie drew her sword angrily and stood, tears streaming down her face. "You guys run. It's coming back," she hissed through clenched teeth. "But Jessie, you'll run. Now, damn it." Ash reached out to her somberly. "Ash, come on," Misty said, tugging at his shirt. "But, Jessie, she can take care of herself. Let's get out of here." Brock answered, and they fled the area. Jessie stood waiting for the murderer of her two best friends to return. She let the tears flow freely. She didn't have anything left to live for now. "Show your ugly head, coward," she yelled, her voice tight with emotion. As if in an answer, the vine dragon burst from the ground, the lower half of its sinuous body hidden in the earth and rock, its jaws still red with blood, now with shimmering specks of blue. Seeing the feathers, Jessie shrieked a last war cry and lunged toward the beast's chest, driving her sword deep into emerald flesh. The dragon flung its head back, howling in agony and frustration. It slowly curled its razor claws about the sword, ripping it from its bosom, hot, thick, white blood pouring from the wound. Jessie backed away, fearfully, using her long tail to guide her. She gasped in pain as it jammed sharply into a tree, her knees buckling with the pain. The vine dragon drew in a deep breath, the wound sealing with fresh vine material. Jessie gasped in terror and froze to the spot as it slunk deviously from the hole. Its jaws opened to a gaping abyss, and Jessie closed her eyes as its wrath was brought upon her. "Jessie? Where is she?" Ash began to panic as he realized the red-haired companion was missing. Brock and Misty's faces grew sullen. "She must have not made it," Brock whispered. "No, she had to. I know she made it," Ash demanded, balling his fists angrily. "Just like James made it, and Meowth and Pikachu made it too?" Misty sneered contemptuously. Ash literally snarled and leapt on Misty, knocking her flat on the ground. "Misty, how dare you? How dare you? God damn you, Misty!" he cried, punching her firmly in the cheek. She cried out in both physical and mental pain, the flames flaring about, Ash beginning to sear her scaled body. Misty threw the hysterical youth off her easily and, just for good measure, kicked him firmly in the side. He buckled under the force and lay still, sobs racking his sides. When Misty was certain the assault had ended, she struggled to her feet, brushing the dirt from her clothes, and let him sob bitterly on the ground. "Stop it, Ash," she yelled, slapping him vengefully across the face. He recoiled at the blow, falling to the ground again, sobbing harder than ever. A few moments later, he pulled himself from the ground slowly and looked into her azure eyes mournfully. Misty softened, her eyes glistening with tears. "They're gone, all gone," she whispered, dropping to her knees next to Ash. Brock was forced to keep to himself, his wiser, older mind preventing him from becoming hysterical. He was just as hurt, upset, and completely grief-stricken as his friends, but they had a duty to fulfill. He sat on the ground, looking up at the moon. He'd never felt more remorse at a loss since his mother had died. Though he hadn't known Jessie and James and been truly friends with them for long, their deaths, as well as Meowth's and Pikachu's, had left him emotionally wasted. He heard a small rustle in the dense foliage of the forest where they sat. Turning around sharply, he observed nothing out of the ordinary. The man of stone never knew what hit him. He heard a roar behind him, and then all was darkness. Ash looked up and leapt out of the path of the dragon as it swooped past them, gathering Brock and Misty in its wake. It dove beneath the crust with its prize and instantly surfaced, leaving two gaping mouths of holes. Ash lost what little was left of his mind seeing the snarling beast. Come back to finish your meal, huh? He shrieked, drawing his sword. The dragon seemed to laugh at him, flicking a long forked tongue into the youth's face. I do what my master obeys. My name is Thurangan, but you may call me the bringer of death. The lithe creature hissed in a venomous voice, slowly advancing upon the helpless human. Ash swiftly drew his arm up, carrying the sword with it. It grazed over the rose eye of Thurangan. He recoiled in pain, roaring in protest. Ash scrambled to his feet, holding the blade in front of him for safety, the red stone illuminating brightly with his fury. My eye! Foolish child! You will pay for your offense, Thurangan screeched, clutching the wound. Seeing his chance, Ash lunged forward with a great battle cry, his sword poised for the kill, the hate and sorrow driving his body. The boy was fast, but the dragon was swifter, batting him away as he approached with the back of a foot like a mere insect. Ash sailed through the air as if he weighed nothing, his flight ending in the top of a tree. He felt the branches strike in random places on his body as he tumbled down to the ground. The beating was interrupted by a short, smooth fall, broken by the hard, cold ground. He lay at the base of the tree, nestled in a tangle of roots, bleeding and out of breath. Thurangan laughed spitefully and raised his tail high above the beaten youth. Some great leader of the 7 powers. Now, boy, you die, he yelled, bringing the thick whip of a tail down upon Ash's already bruised and broken body. He felt the sharp scales slice easily into mortal flesh, breaking several ribs in the process. He cried out in agony, every move biting at his mind and body with pain. It hurt to move, it hurt to breathe, it practically hurt to think. Ash opened his formerly tightly shut eyes to survey himself. The side of his chest was drenched in blood from the wound, as well as slightly collapsed with the broken bones. He looked through blurring vision at the ever-widening pool of nearly black liquid beneath him and slowly rested his head on his arms, the life slowly draining from his body. Two can't die now. What happened to the 7 great powers? He whispered to himself. His breath grew short and labored as the youth's lungs filled with blood. He closed his eyes as his broken body lurched forward, retching the life fluid from his mouth. Thurangan laughed and raised his tail once more. You really are just a boy, aren't you? He asked, smiling. Ash let the blood flow freely from his mouth in a crimson river across the dirt as he drew his last breath. The dragon roared in victory and brought his tail down. Ash closed his eyes as he felt it strike him in the head. Then all went black. Whispers. Whispers echoed in the deep hollow of the youth's mind, muttering useless phrases, background noise to his own thoughts. Where am I? You're someplace. Always, always light penetrated through the darkness, rays of it swirling in a theatrical dance, reflected in some sort of mist. A pleasant sight after the atrocity that had been the fearful silence. What's going on? The fear was setting in now, deeply rooted and paralyzing. Don't fear us. What the hell is going on? What's happening? Am I dead? Yes, but you must go back. Why? It's peaceful here. The voices echoed, sweet and inviting, letting the boy know he had nothing to fear. He relaxed now, knowing bliss was not far away. Go back. Find the powers. I thought we were them. What's happening? The voices whispered goodbye as the sinking feeling of falling twisted his stomach. Falling. Ash sat up with a start. Had he been dreaming? He slowly opened his eyes, adjusting to the low level of light. He moved a hand to wipe the sweat dripping from his forehead, but found he couldn't. His fiery arms and legs were bound securely to a low wooden bunk in some sort of cell. He pulled at the chain angrily and let it slide with a loud clatter to the floor. Wait! The wound, he whispered to himself and placed his hand gingerly on his side. Nothing was there, no scar, no bandage, nothing, as if he had never been injured in the first place. He forgot the manacles and looked up to find himself in a cell of some sorts. It was dank and moldy, the smell of blood and a soft dripping filling the boy's senses. He felt a shiver run up and down his spine, and he wrapped his arms around himself for comfort. Well, what do we have here? Ash's head snapped up to see the evil entity of Weintraub looming above him. I hate coming down here. It's so, how shall I say, medieval, she mused, grinning sadistically. Ash refused to answer and turned his head away from the spiteful queen. Oh, I hurt your feelings, did I? I'm so sorry. Everything will be fine soon enough, she said, examining a razor-sharp, pink fingernail. The boy reacted instantly, standing swiftly and gripping the bars of the cell. Weintraub greeted the problem coolly, looking up at the youth, a smug smile painted upon her face. What do you mean? Ash asked harshly. The queen seemed delighted at this question, turning a small pirouette on the cold cobblestone floor. She giggled like a small child and waltzed back, stepping only on the stones, her slender and agile feet never touching a crack. You'll be one of us. Isn't that wonderful? You'll get to, destroy cities that oppose my rule, kill innocent bystanders. In general, you'll be nice and evil. Just like me and your precious friends. Ash felt his knees weaken at the mention of his companions. His stomach turned to flip inside of him, and he slowly sunk to the cold wood of the makeshift bed. What have you done with them? He asked quietly. Ash. He looked up quickly to see Thurangan haul a bedraggled James into the room. A pang of fear tore through his mind and body, and a few points of light danced in the corners of his vision. Leave him alone, he cried, standing again. James cried out sharply in pain as he was subjected to the dragon's wrath, curling into a small defensive ball. Thurangan seemed to enjoy his pain, reveling in it, as if it were sweet. James retaliated, kicking the dragon firmly in the ribs with the hard sole of his knee-high leather boot. He roared in pain and swept his tail down in a wide arc, gathering James and sending him hurtling into the wall. James crumpled into a heap of blue feathers and didn't move. That'll be quite enough, Thurangan dear, Weintraub said, gathering the great neck into her arms. The dragon ran his tongue along her leathery plant like skin affectionately. Weintraub giggled softly and cooed to the dragon like a child. James pushed himself up with difficulty, blood dripping from his nose. He put a hand to it and slowly pulled the rumpled wings into their correct positions. He looked hurt and innocent, like a beaten child. Seeing the blood, he scowled and assumed a furious air of nobility that would stay with him to the end. James, Ash breathed, reaching out to him sorrowfully. The blue-haired youth looked up at him, fire burning behind the emerald eyes. Don't let her get you, Ash, he whispered, his stern face leaving a lasting imprint on Ash's mind. Weintraub heard his words and raised an eyebrow scornfully. I've had just about enough of you, she exclaimed, extending her hand outwards. James' eyes widened in terror as a veritable web of vines spewed forth from her hand, summoned by her powerful magic, gathering him from the floor and pinning him to the grimy wall. He cried out in pain, yet again, as his back collided with tremendous force with cold, hard stone, and Ash was forced to close his eyes and turn away. James gasped for breath as Weintraub sauntered casually to the entangled youth and took his chin in her emerald hand gingerly. James struggled against the vines, but only succeeded in making his imprisonment worse. After a few moments, his chest stopped heaving as he gained a second wind. His emerald eyes met the fiery red ones of Weintraub, and the youth glared daggers at the malevolent queen. Now, are we ready to turn over a new feather, shall we say? She asked softly. Her prisoner closed his eyes and turned his head away. Just do what she wants, James, please, Ash pleaded softly. The pale light from the torches strung about the wall reflected a glint from James' cheek. Tears slid unabashed from beneath his closed lids. Never, James whispered, the tears mingling with the blood from his nose. Weintraub looked disappointed, pursing her lips remorsefully. That's too bad, Thurangan mused. I'm sorry I have to do this to you. Such a handsome boy, she whispered seductively and pressed her lips against his. James recoiled in disgust, opening his eyes wide with terror. Weintraub leaned into it, as if she'd known James for years and was truly in love with him. Ash clenched his teeth as the kiss slowly became more passionate. This was a cruel torture indeed. He knew he had deep-rooted feelings for Jessie and hated to see anyone not end up with whom they truly loved. He imagined what the queen had done with his Misty and shuddered. Weintraub slowly slid her hand from James' chin to his throat and pulled away. James seemed relieved until the long, slender fingers soon found themselves tightly wrapped around his throat. He opened his mouth as wide as it would go, gulping fruitlessly for air. "Stop!" Ash cried, leaping to his feet. "Insolent child," was her only response. "You'll kill him." Weintraub only laughed and tightened her grip around the throat of her prisoner. James's eyes rolled dramatically back into his head as his body shut down without life-giving air. The lid slid slowly over the glittering emerald irises and closed, and he slumped forward, lifeless. "No." Weintraub rolled her eyes at the stupidity of her next victim and raised her hand dramatically. A ball of bright orange energy gathered there. She fiddled with it a moment, took James' chin in her hand, and rammed the light down his throat. He inhaled deeply, taking the energy with a lung full of air. Weintraub backed away, smiling in pure glee. James raised his head slowly, never bothering to open his eyes, and inhaled deeply. He opened his eyes as he audibly released the air. Ash gasped, half in terror, half in amazement. James' eyes were now the same rose-irised ones of Thurangan. "That felt good," he said in a voice that was not his own. James was no longer present in this situation. His mind, self, practically even his body had been caged inside his own mind. There was a demon in his place, one that had a black heart and soul, if it had any at all. "Good boy," Weintraub said, and the vines retracted, allowing the demon to step down. The mere shell of what James had been stepped across the floor slowly, taking it all in, and stopped directly in front of Ash's cell. The boy looked up into his friend's eyes. He could still see him there. He could have given up. He could have let James go. But he was still there. He could save him. "James, listen to me. I know you're in there. Don't let Weintraub win. Don't. Fight it, James," he cried, leaping to his feet, the chains rattling loudly. They echoed in the silence that followed. The demon stood up, looking at the boy quizzically, and its eyes flashed a brilliant green for a split second, and James' body sunk to its knees, groaning in pain and holding its head. "No, go back where you belong." The voice of the demon scowled. "I won't. Leave me now. I'll never give up. Get out." Ash stared on as James battled with the foreign entity in his mind, his voice prevailing sometimes, the demon's most of the time. He writhed about in sheer pain on the ground, clutching at his skull as if it were about to split open. The near silence was suddenly pierced by a voice, screaming in agony and defeat. Ash smiled. He believed James had won. He shook his head to clear it and stood, holding a hand to his obviously aching skull. He smiled wryly and turned to Weintraub. She looked momentarily frightened, but sighed in relief. James took a deep breath and began brushing himself off. Well, that was annoying. The voice was gruff and unfamiliar. Ash closed his eyes remorsefully. James had lost. The demon turned to face him, and he looked away disapprovingly. "This boy has potential. He almost got this nuisance to win," he said, laughing spitefully. "Did you kill him?" Weintraub asked, placing her hands on her hips triumphantly. "No," Ash screeched, rattling his chains. Weintraub shot him a foul look, and he ceased. She turned back to James, who shrugged in response and closed his eyes. "Let me see," he mumbled, placing his index fingers gently upon his temples. The eyes twitched violently under the closed lids, and after a brief second, they opened again. "He's still alive." Ash heaved a loud sigh of relief. Weintraub patted her new minion fondly on the shoulder. "Go to the labyrinth. Leave me with the little boy," she instructed. The demon nodded and briskly walked off, taking a sword with him, James' sword. As if in goodbye, it caught the meager light and flashed brightly. The footsteps resounded against the bare walls, getting softer and farther away. Soon, they weren't audible any longer, and the malevolent fiend turned to face her prize. When the demon had gone completely, the queen walked over to Ash, her boots clicking softly on stone. "You think James was the only one of your friends I corrupted?" she asked. Ash bit his lip and stared straight into the glittering red eyes. They danced with childlike glee, hiding a sadistic mind which reveled in superiority and the pain of others. She'd enjoyed corrupting James' mind, and Ash knew it. "They're all like that now," she whispered, leaning down. He felt the sting of tears in the corners of his vision. but did not let them fall. God save him if he cried in front of this evil being. Not in a mood to talk, huh? I know what'll get you talking. I'll tell you a lovely story. Weintraub said, her voice dripping with syrup. Ash scowled and looked away as the tale began. Once upon a time, there were two young people. Oh, they were very happy. Very happy indeed. One boy and a lovely young girl. The boy had deep feelings of love for this girl, but she didn't know it, nor did she love him back. She viewed him as a friend. Their names were Ash and Misty. Stop. Stop it now. Weintraub looked hurt and shook a finger at Ash like you would a small child. Didn't your mommy ever tell you it's rude to interrupt? Now, swiftly moving on. One day, Ash and Misty were walking through the forest. A kind and beautiful queen saw them and noticed they were trespassing on her royal soil. Now, this queen was much smarter than anyone in Ash and Misty's group of friends, and she already knew that they'd try to overthrow her. So, she came up with a clever plan. She sent her cute little pet dragon to capture them. And capture them he did. They thought their good friends had been killed, making them angered and so very sad. But this made them all the more easy to catch. They're not all dead. Ash began to understand now. Weintraub glared at him, cleared her throat, and continued. Now, first this queen wanted to kill this group of nosy little children, but she decided they were much too strong to just torture and then dispose of. So, she had some of her strongest monsters killed instead. Their souls were then fed into their minds, making them one of us. But poor little Misty, she wasn't as cooperative as the rest. What have you done with her? Where the hell is she? Oh, now, you'll never get anywhere with that attitude. Where was I? Oh, yes. Poor Misty, she had such an attitude. Her mind had to be completely erased before she'd cooperate. But finally, the good queen succeeded, and with Ash, the final threat, gone forever, a prisoner in his own mind, she could finally crush those troublesome little rebellions. Ash felt dizzy as he watched swirls of bright color dash across his vision. Misty was gone. He knew James was still somewhere in the confused and black mind, but James wasn't gone. The rest of his friends were probably the same way. He could free them. No, please God, no, he whispered, cupping his forehead in his palms. I think I'll let you mull that over a bit. Besides, I need to check on my other new mercenaries. Ciao. For now, Ashy dear. Weintraub practically trilled her response and walked off briskly, her hips swinging in mockery and triumph. The youth collapsed to the ground, tears streaming freely now down his cheeks. I'll kill you, Weintraub. I swear I'll get my revenge for what you've done. He hissed, his flames burning brightly with rage. The tears sizzled and turned to steam as his burning flesh heated to monstrous proportions. He clenched his fists and brought them to his face, focusing on his wrists. The flames licked at the metal shackles, turning them white with heat. Ash picked at the soft material until his wrists were freed and immediately rubbed them tenderly, the soft, vulnerable skin sore and bruised. He frowned and stood up slowly, abandoning his mild injuries, and faced the next problem presented, the metal bars. He backed up as far as he could go and held his hands out in front of him. He closed his eyes and concentrated on his palms. One more time, Misty, he whispered sadly, and the image of her in the white gown came to him once again. He smiled, mouthed a goodbye to the girl in his mind, and opened his eyes to see a large glowing sphere collecting in his palms. He drew it in close to his body and felt the molten core with his fingers. He condensed it into a raging inferno and raised it high above his head. We'll never give up, he breathed, and with a great battle cry, hurled his weapon into the bars. The ancient steel gave away easily to the intense heat with a great crash of fire and molten metal, leaving a gaping hole in the bars. Ash smiled in victory and dashed out through the opening. He stopped in a small pathway by the cell. He heard nothing, saw nothing, sensed nothing, and smiled. He began down the hall where he'd seen James and Weintraub leave, determination with a purpose etched into his mind, and a warm red glow welcomed him. He stopped his tracks and looked down to see his sword resting against the wall. "Oh man, am I ever glad to see you," he said to the blade and picked it up. He flung it quickly through the loops on his pants, and once again, the trusty weapon was at his side. Feeling better now that he was armed again, Ash continued down the hall. It seemed to go on forever. The death-like silence settled deeply over what seemed like thousands of years. There were no doors, only stones, mold, and an odd dripping sound, the only light coming from the fireblade. Suddenly, Ash nearly broke his nose on an ornately decorated door. He unsheathed his sword and brought the jewel to the carvings. It was an odd pattern of solid lines. They wound aimlessly about until ending abruptly in the very center where an enormous bright red stone was set. "Whoa," Ash muttered. "Welcome. Come and join the party." Ash clenched his teeth. This had all been planned. Weintraub had told James to go wait in the labyrinth. He placed one hand cautiously against the old carvings on the door and pushed. Surprisingly, despite its size and weight, it slid open quite easily. Ash shoved it roughly to the side, sending a cloud of tiny birds scattering from a large bush of the greenest ivy Ash had ever seen in his life. The door shut with a tremendous slam behind him, and he whirled around in fright. He pressed against the door to find it securely locked and banged his fist in frustration. Ash sighed and turned around to survey his new surroundings. The lighting in this place was an odd, almost misty light like that of very early morning. It was absolutely dead silent, the fog holding in any sound selfishly. Midnight blackbirds would occasionally jet across the pallid sky, but other than that the place was completely devoid of life. Ash took one step, and it resounded loudly across the profoundly huge courtyard. He scowled at his own loudness. The stones were designed to echo like that. It made escape much less plausible. He looked up and let his jaw drop in perplexity. Before him was a vast expanse of green, small breaks in it indicating the path, and in the very center, a large square where a faint red glow emanated. The flames licked with a new lust at Ash's limbs and tail as he began down the path. It went on for only a short while before sectioning off to go four ways. "This is your choice now, Ashy. Choose wisely. It may mean the difference in your bleak-looking future." The booming voice was accompanied by Venetra's insidious laughter. Ash gritted his teeth and turned to the right. "Right? Is that the right way?" The laughter followed again, and Ash shuddered at the sound of it. He drew his sword and turned to go right. There was a sudden flurry of ivy leaves, and Ash backed away, raising his sword in defense. "Always were a wimp, Ash." The boy stopped. The voice was all too familiar. He didn't want to look up. He knew who was there. He knew the person had once been his enemy, transformed by a common future to his friend, now his mortal enemy again. He wouldn't hesitate to kill him, but Ash could never bring himself to play steel against flesh. Though he was now possessed by a demon, he was still mortal. He could still be killed. "Nice to see you again, James," he said somberly. The snicker that followed was pure evil. Ash closed his eyes and slowly rose to meet his opponent. To Ash's surprise, Jesse stood back to back with James, just as they had so many times as they recited their motto. "Prepare for trouble." Jesse's voice was no longer her own, just like her partner and friend. "And you can make that double." James looked like a shell of his former self. His green irises gone. His eyes looked tired, yet very much alive and abundant with evil energy, dark shadows hanging somberly below them. Jesse, too, had the flaming eyes and dark circles, making the pair look quite sadistic indeed. Ash readied his sword hesitantly, taking a warrior's stance. James drew his sword and let it hang loosely at his side, seeming to the young hero in mockery. "He thinks he could defeat us, James." Jesse mused. The blue-haired demon next to her scowled. "He could easily beat you anyway," he said scornfully. "Yeah, right." James ignored the remark and twirled the end of his blade between two cobblestones, leaning on it casually like a cane. He grinned with pure malice as his head suddenly snapped up to face the boy, and with a loud war cry, lunged for the youth. Ash caught the force of the blow with his sword, deflecting it to one side. James sailed past him, performed a lissom flip, and stood silently, his back facing Ash. He closed his eyes and laughed softly, he head cocked thoughtfully to one side. "Very good, boy, but not good enough," he yelled, whirling around and jabbing swiftly with deadly accuracy toward Ash's chest. The blade missed its mark, and the demon skidded to a halt. "Stop playing imbecile and kill him." Jesse screeched. James rolled the fiery red eyes and slowly brought his sword parallel to his face. He closed his eyes nobly and grinned, showing both rows of teeth. His wings snapped out to either side like switchblades and curled under slightly with anticipation. With a flurry of cerulean feathers and only one flap of the great wings, James was airborne. He rocketed up to the ashen sky and dove back down, sword held in outstretched arms. He swooped down, and Ash leapt hurriedly out of the way, landing in one of the ivy bushes. He gripped the branches to prevent himself from falling and slowly turned around, his back facing the bush. James lighted in front of him and smiled in victory. Ash could feel the tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, and he raised his blade. James touched the tip of his sword to Ash's menacingly. The youth's face was serious with anger as he withdrew the blade and slid it with a neat hiss into its sheath. The demon looked confused and, as a last resort, drove the hilt of his sword into Ash's stomach roughly. He cried out in pain and dropped the ground, where James promptly pinned him to his back. The first time Ash felt the cold metal of a blade against his throat scared him more than anything had so far. "Why do you not fight me, child? Is it that you want to die? Or perhaps you are too cowardly even to defend yourself?" James asked. Ash had several witty responses he could have thrown at him had his life not been in danger. He gritted his teeth and let the tears fall. "Because I won't hurt a friend," he answered. "A friend? You still consider me a friend?" "What a joke." James began laughing hideously at this remark. Jessie joined him from her silent vigil. "No, not you. James is still in there. He's my friend, and I won't hurt him," Ash hissed, his throat tight with tears. "Finish him off, James," Jessie said with glee. "Gladly," he replied menacingly and readied the blade. Ash closed his eyes, waiting for the pain, the blood, death. He waited, but nothing came, and he cautiously opened his eyes. Something was holding James back. He knelt by the boy's side, the sword loosely pressed against his throat. Aye, he stuttered. Ash smiled and sat up. The sword did not enter flesh. He saw something in his eyes, something in the very back of his mind was telling James not to kill his friend. The real James was fighting back. "Come on, James, you can do it. We can help Jessie. We can help all of them. Fight it, James," Ash called. Jessie, the single utterance gave Ash hope. It had been James' voice. "What are you waiting for? Kill him." Jessie drew her sword in anticipation. No, James screamed, clutching his head. "James, I know how you feel. I know you love her. She's the same as you. You gotta save her," Ash called triumphantly. James screamed in agony and curled into a tiny protector ball onto the ground. "James, no." To Ash's surprise, Jesse's voice prevailed over the demon. He looked to his former friend, now writhing on the cold stones in pain, and winced in empathy. His eyes had rolled completely into the back of his head, leaving only blank, lifeless whites. Jessie burst forward, catching Ash by the throat, and curled her razor-like claws firmly around it. She hefted him swiftly from the ground and pressed his back into the unforgiving branches of the ivy. "No one defies the master and lives," she snarled and tightened her grip around the hapless victim's neck. Ash clawed at her arm, trying to free himself of the vice grip that cut off his supply of oxygen. He felt his mind give away slowly, and he let his eyelids close. This is it. This is how it all ends after being transported here, surviving in this new world, even being killed by a dragon. I get strangled to death by one of my friends. Ash's mind was somber in its last moments. What happened? He could have sworn he had heard James' voice. Time seemed to move in slow motion for him as he felt his body give away and slip into death. "No, Ash." Darkness reigned until with a rush of colors and light. He felt air fill his lungs once more, and he coughed and sputtered as he regained consciousness. He gripped his temporarily aching head and opened his eyes. James sat atop Jessie, her arms pinned securely to the ground. Upon closer inspection, Ash's heart soared with triumph and exuberance as he saw that his eyes gleamed with a renewed emerald color. James had won. The demon was dead, and he was back for good. Jessie was putting up the struggle of her life, and James was just barely able to hold her down. "Infidel, how dare you oppose the queen?" Jessie screeched. Seeing his friend's distress, Ash rushed to help contain the struggling redhead. Jesse, please, listen to me. You've got to come back, James said firmly, looking deeply into the crimson eyes. Two won't betray the queen, she answered through tightly clenched teeth. James felt the sting of tears in the corners of his vision and let them fall freely. Please come back to me, Jesse. You can't be gone, he whispered. The demon smiled. Jesse doesn't live here anymore, she spat. James looked away into Ash. Help her, James, please, he begged. Jesse, you can't be gone, he whispered, turning back to face the body of his friend. And why not? I don't sense her anywhere, the demon replied coyly. The tears were falling unabashed and in large quantities, leaving dirty streaks down his face. He leaned down close to her face, and the demon looked quite disgusted at this aspect. You can't be gone. You can't be, because two love you, he whispered and lightly pressed his lips against hers, his tears falling on her cheeks. Jesse's fire eyes opened widely in terror as James kissed her. Ash looked on in amazement and just barely detected a high-pitched shriek, and a large dark cloud rose from Jesse's skull. It exploded in a cataclysmic flash high in the air and was gone. He stared at the glittering remnants as they floated downwards and knew that Jesse was now liberated as well. He smiled and looked to his two friends. James, what happened? Jesse's voice and eyes were her own again. Jesse, he cried, wrapping his arms securely around her. She smiled and laughed briefly. You okay? She asked him as he finally let her go. James smiled, his eyes glimmering with hope and happiness. I'm fine now. I'm glad you're all right, he answered. Jesse grinned back and pulled him into one more hug. Ash knelt by them and put a hand on each of their shoulders. Glad to have you guys back, he said, grinning. I heard what you said, Ash. Thanks for not giving up on me, James said, and thanks for being my friend. Ash patted him affectionately on the shoulder. Anytime, James. You too, Jesse, he said. She winked in response, and James helped her up. Ash adjusted his belt and turned to his friends. We got to help everyone else. With you guys, it should be much easier, he said, assuming the leadership position. Right, let's go, Jessie said, curling her fingers into a fist eagerly. Ash nodded to them, and they set off to liberate the rest of their group. Jessie poked James in the ribs with her elbow. Ow, what? He asked. Did you say something to me right before I came back? She replied, putting her hands on her hips. James swallowed hard. No, nothing, why? He answered. Jessie raised one eyebrow and fingered the tip of one of her cat ears thoughtfully. It's just I could have sworn never mind, she said, and they continued on their quest to find their friends, the rest of the 7 powers. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you all are enjoyed this video. If you do, please leave a like, share, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to support author of this fanfic. So let's end this video here. Until then, see you in next video.